Chapter 1. The Weight of Paper and Memory. Petunia. Dursley had always prided herself on maintaining perfect order in her household, but Vernon's study looked as though a paper tornado had swept through it. Letters were scattered across his desk like autumn leaves, some yellowed with age, others bearing the distinctive thick parchment that made her stomach clench with familiar dread. She stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame, watching her husband compare handwriting samples with the methodical precision he usually reserved for his drill company accounts. A fresh envelope lay opened beside his elbow. The Morning Post, she realized, though the sun had barely crested the privet hedge outside. "Vernon." Her voice came out sharper than intended, cutting through the morning stillness. "What are you doing?" He looked up, his thick neck reddening above his collar. For a man who pontificated endlessly about proper breakfast schedules and the importance of routine, he appeared remarkably guilty about his early morning activities. "Just checking something, pet. Nothing for you to worry about." But Petunia was already moving closer, and her breath caught when she recognized the familiar slant of handwriting on one of the scattered pages. Lily's handwriting, her sister's careful loops and crosses, frozen in ink for 15 years. "Where did you get those?" The question emerged as barely more than a whisper. Vernon's face cycled through several expressions before settling on defensive irritation. "Found them in your trinket box when I was looking for the spare house keys last week. Thought you'd thrown out all that nonsense years ago." The lie sat between them like a physical thing. Petunia had never kept house keys in her jewelry box, and Vernon knew it. He'd been searching for something else entirely, probably more of Harry's correspondence to intercept and destroy. The realization made something cold and sharp twist in her chest. "You had no right," she said, stepping forward to gather the letters, but Vernon's large hand slammed down on the pile. "I had every right. This is still my house, and I won't have reminders of her cluttering up our lives." He gestured at the opened envelope beside him. "Especially when her freak of a nephew keeps receiving more of the same rubbish." Petunia's eyes fell on the fresh letter, recognizing the official seal she'd learned to dread over the past few summers. Order business, most likely. Another reminder of the war that had been creeping closer to Privet Drive with each passing year, bringing danger to her doorstep, whether she acknowledged it or not. "Harry's mail is Harry's business," she said, though the words felt strange in her mouth. When had she ever defended the boy? "Harry's business." Vernon's voice climbed toward the register that usually preceded his most explosive tantrums. "That boy's business has nearly gotten our Dudley killed twice over, and now they want him back there, at that school, when there's a war on." He was right, of course. Petunia had heard enough whispered conversations between Order members to understand that Hogwarts was no longer the safe haven Lily had once described in her letters. But something in Vernon's possessive grip on her sister's correspondence, something in the way he'd violated her private grief, made her stand straighter. "Give me the letters, Vernon." "So you can moon over them again? Fill your head with more of their nonsense?" He gathered the papers closer to himself. "I should have burned them years ago. Should burn the lot of them now, including this fresh batch of lies they're sending the boy." The word "burned" hit Petunia like a physical blow. She thought of Lily's careful descriptions of the magical photographs that moved in their frames, of the way her sister's face had lit up when she wrote about her new friends, and the wonders she was learning. All of it reduced to ash because Vernon couldn't bear to be reminded that magic existed in the world. "No." The word came out with a force that surprised them both. Vernon blinked at her. "What did you say?" "I said no." Petunia straightened to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than her husband, but felt somehow more significant in this moment. "You will not burn my sister's letters. You will not destroy Harry's mail, and you will not make decisions about what I choose to keep or remember in my own home. For 15 years, Vernon had been the final authority on all matters related to magic, Lily, and Harry Potter. Petunia had deferred to his judgment, allowed his fears to become her own, let his disgust colour her treatment of the boy who was all she had left of her sister. But standing in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his snooping and scheming, she felt something long dormant stirring to life. Vernon's face had progressed from red to purple. "You're being hysterical, Pet. It's just old letters from a dead woman. They don't mean anything anymore. They mean everything." The admission surprised her with its honesty. "She was my sister, Vernon. Whatever else happened between us, whatever I failed to do, she was my sister." She reached for the letters again, and this time Vernon's resistance seemed to crumble. His hand fell away, leaving the scattered correspondence vulnerable to her gathering touch. As her fingers closed around the familiar paper, 15 years of suppressed grief threatened to overwhelm her. Lily's final letter lay on top, the one that had arrived 3 days before Halloween 1981. Petunia had read it once, that terrible morning when Dumbledore brought Harry to her doorstep, and then buried it with all the rest in the depths of her jewellery box. She'd told herself she was protecting Vernon from reminders of pain, protecting Dudley from knowledge that would only frighten him. Really, she'd been protecting herself from the truth that her sister had tried, even at the end, to rebuild the bridge between them. "I'm going to read them," she announced, clutching the letters to her chest. "All of them. Properly." Vernon made a sound like a deflating balloon. "Petunia, be reasonable. That way lies madness. You'll only upset yourself over things that can't be changed." Perhaps it's time I was upset. The words felt foreign on her tongue, revolutionary in their honesty. Perhaps I've been too comfortable for too long. She turned to leave his study, but Vernon's voice stopped her at the threshold. "And the boy's letter? What about that?" Petunia looked back at him, this man who had shaped her choices for decades through his fears and prejudices. He was holding the order correspondence like it might burst into flames at any moment. "Give it to Harry," she said simply. "It's his." Vernon's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to splutter, "But the danger is coming whether we acknowledge it or not." Petunia surprised herself with the clarity of the observation. At least if Harry knows what's happening, he can protect himself. Protect all of us. She left Vernon gaping in his study and climbed the stairs to her bedroom, feeling lighter and more terrified than she had in years. The letters seemed to pulse with warmth in her hands, as though 15 years hadn't passed at all, as though Lily might still be writing to her from that castle in Scotland where magic lived and breathed and shaped the world according to rules Petunia had never learned. In her room, she spread the letters across her pristine bedspread in chronological order. September 1971 to October 1981. 10 years of her sister's life, documented in careful handwriting that had grown more elegant and then more urgent as the years passed. The first letter was written on Hogwarts stationery, the ink slightly faded, but still legible. "Dear Toonie," it began, using the childhood nickname that had once been affection and later became mockery. "I know you're angry with me for leaving, but I had to write and tell you about the most amazing thing." Petunia sat on the edge of her bed and began to read her sister's life. By the time she reached the final letter, the one that spoke of prophecies and hidden dangers, of love that could protect beyond death, of hopes that someday Petunia would understand why Lily had made the choices she did. The sun was high and hot outside her window. Vernon had long since stopped calling her name from downstairs. She folded the last letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Her hands were shaking, but not from grief this time. From rage. From a righteous anger that had been building for 15 years and had finally found its target. Lily had been afraid, terrified actually, in those final months. Not just of dying, but of what would happen to Harry if she did. She'd trusted Dumbledore to protect her son, trusted the magical world to care for the child they called their salvation. And what had they done? They dumped him on Petunia's doorstep with a letter explaining nothing and expecting everything. They'd left him to be raised by people who feared magic and resented his existence. They'd allowed him to return to Privet Drive each summer, thinner and more withdrawn than when he'd left, and never questioned why. Petunia stood and moved to her window, looking out at the ordinary suburban street where she'd spent 30 years, convincing herself that normal was better than magical, that safety lay in conformity and silence. But Harry's life had been neither safe nor normal, and Lily's letters made it clear that his suffering had been preventable, if anyone with authority had bothered to care about his well-being rather than his usefulness. The decision crystallized in her mind with startling clarity. She would drive to Hogwarts. Today. She would demand answers from Albus Dumbledore, the man her sister had trusted with everything. She would ask him to explain why Lily's sacrifice had been deemed sufficient to save the wizarding world, but not enough to ensure her son's happiness. And she would bring the letters with her, every damning word of love and fear and hope that Lily had written, as evidence of promises broken and trust betrayed. For the first time in 15 years, Petunia Dursley was going to fight for Harry Potter, because Lily would have expected nothing less from the sister she'd never stopped loving, even when that love wasn't returned. Chapter 2. The Drive to Destiny. Petunia had never driven farther from Little Whinging than the shopping centre in Greater London, but she found herself programming directions to Scotland into Vernon's ancient road atlas with trembling fingers. The morning sun slanted through the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny golden snitches, a comparison that would have horrified her yesterday, but somehow seemed fitting today. "I'm going out," she announced to Vernon, who was methodically buttering toast as though the world hadn't shifted on its axis an hour earlier. "I may be gone overnight." He looked up from his breakfast, confusion creasing his features. "Gone? Gone where?" "To see Lily's school." The words came easier than expected. "I need to visit where she was happy." Vernon's face cycled through several expressions before settling on uncomfortable sympathy. In 15 years of marriage, Petunia had never expressed any desire to connect with her sister's memory. He clearly assumed she meant Godric's Hollow, where the graves were, or perhaps some memorial the freak community had erected. That's probably healthy, pet," he said carefully, as though speaking to someone fragile. "Closure and all that. Just be careful on the roads." If only he knew, she thought, gathering Lily's letters into a neat stack and tucking them into her handbag alongside the fresh order correspondence she'd claimed from his study. If only he understood that she was about to drive directly into the heart of everything he'd spent decades trying to protect their family from. The car, Vernon's aging Ford Escort, coughed reluctantly to life in the driveway. Petunia had learned to drive as a practical necessity, but she'd never enjoyed it. Today, however, gripping the steering wheel felt like taking control of her life for the first time in years. The first hour of the journey passed uneventfully. She followed the M25 around London, then headed north on roads that grew progressively smaller and more winding. The familiar landscapes of suburban England gradually gave way to rolling hills and patches of forest that seemed older, wilder than anything she'd encountered in her ordered existence. It was near the Scottish border that strange things began to happen. At first it was subtle, a persistent feeling that she'd missed a turning, despite following the atlas precisely, an inexplicable urge to stop for petrol, even though the tank was nearly full. Twice she found herself pulling into lay-bys without remembering making the decision, sitting in the car with the engine running and wondering why she'd stopped. "Concentrate, Petunia," she muttered to herself, checking the directions again. According to Lily's letters, the ones from her later years at Hogwarts, the school was somewhere in the Scottish Highlands, hidden from Muggle view, but accessible to those who knew what they were looking for. The problem was that Petunia wasn't entirely sure what she was looking for. As she drove deeper into the Highlands, the urges to turn back grew stronger. Her hands began to shake on the steering wheel, and a voice in her head, not her own voice, but something external and insistent, whispered that she was wasting her time, that Vernon would be worried, that she should go home and forget this foolishness. "No," she said aloud, her voice echoing in the car's small interior. "No, I won't turn back." To steady herself, she began reciting passages from Lily's letters from memory. The words she'd absorbed that morning came flooding back with startling clarity, as though her sister's voice was speaking directly into her mind. "The castle is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, Toonie. It sits beside a lake that reflects the stars like scattered diamonds, and there are towers that seem to touch the sky. I wish you could see it with me. I wish you could understand why I love this place so much." The recitation seemed to help. The intrusive thoughts grew quieter, and Petunia found herself able to focus on the increasingly narrow roads that wound through landscapes of breathtaking beauty. She'd never seen mountains like these, ancient and imposing, shrouded in mist that shifted and danced in ways that seemed almost alive. "The forbidden forest borders the school grounds," she continued, drawing from another letter. "Hagrid, he's the groundskeeper, gentle as a lamb despite his size, tells the most wonderful stories about the creatures who live there. He showed me a unicorn once, Toonie. An actual unicorn, silver as moonlight and twice as beautiful." As if summoned by her words, the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of a vast lake in the distance. Petunia's breath caught in her throat. Even through whatever magical barriers were attempting to turn her away, she could see that Lily's descriptions hadn't been exaggerated. The water stretched like a mirror between rolling hills, and on the far shore. Her car sputtered. "No, no, no," she whispered, pressing harder on the accelerator. The engine made a grinding sound that spoke of mechanical distress beyond her limited understanding. "Not now. Please, not now." But the Ford had other ideas. It lurched forward another 100 yards, coughing like a consumptive, before finally shuddering to a complete stop at the edge of a forest that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Petunia sat in the sudden silence, fighting back tears of frustration. She was so close, she could feel it in her bones, a thrumming anticipation that had nothing to do with her usual anxieties, and everything to do with approaching something that had shaped her sister's entire life. She climbed out of the car and lifted the bonnet, though she had no more idea how to repair an engine than she did how to cast a spell. Steam rose from the radiator in malevolent clouds, and several parts that she couldn't name were making ominous clicking sounds. "Bloody hell," she muttered, then clapped a hand over her mouth in shock. She never swore. Vernon disapproved of it, and she'd trained herself out of the habit decades ago. "Problems with your motor, then?" The voice came from behind her, deep and warm with a distinctive accent that she recognized but couldn't place. Petunia spun around, her heart hammering, to find herself facing the largest man she'd ever encountered. He stood nearly 9 feet tall, with wild dark hair and a beard that could have housed a family of birds. His clothes were rough-spun and practical, and his dark eyes were both kind and startlingly intelligent. Despite his intimidating size, something about his presence felt reassuring rather than threatening. Yes," she managed, gesturing helplessly at the steaming engine. It just died. I don't know why." The giant man approached the car, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the engine. "Ah, well, there's your problem right there," he said, pointing to something Petunia couldn't identify. "Muggle engines don't much care for the magical atmosphere hereabouts. Plays havoc with the electrics." Petunia's mouth fell open. He'd said the word Muggle so casually, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment she forgot to be afraid. "You know what I am," she said. It wasn't a question. The man's dark eyes studied her face with sudden intensity. Then, impossibly, his expression brightened into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "Blimey," he breathed. "You're Lily's sister, aren't you? Petunia Evans? Well, I suppose it's Dursley now, but you've got her eyes. Different colour, but the same shape. The same way of tilting your head when you're thinking." Petunia stared at him. "You knew Lily?" "Knew her?" The giant man laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "Course I knew her. Lily Evans was one of the brightest students Hogwarts ever produced. Kind as sunshine, that one, and brave as a lioness when the situation called for it." He extended one enormous hand. "Rubius Hagrid, Keeper of Keys and Grounds at Hogwarts School. At your service, Mrs. Dursley." Petunia found herself shaking his hand, marvelling at how carefully he controlled his strength to avoid crushing her fingers. You remember her?" "Remember her? I could tell you stories about Lily Evans that would make you burst with pride." Hagrid's eyes grew distant with memory. "She used to visit my hut, regular-like, especially after she started seeing young James Potter. Brought me rock cakes she'd made in the kitchens. Terrible cook, your sister. Bless her heart. But the thought was what mattered." Despite everything, Petunia found herself smiling. She never could make a decent biscuit. Her mother despaired of teaching her. "That's her, all right." Hagrid's grin widened. "But she had a way with the magical creatures, she did. Unicorns would come to her call, and the Thestrals. Well, she couldn't see them then, lucky for her, but they'd gentle right down when she was around. Had a gift, she did. A real gift." Petunia felt tears prickling at her eyes. For 15 years, she'd lived with only her own memories of Lily, memories tainted by jealousy and resentment. To hear someone speak of her sister with such genuine affection, to learn that Lily had been loved and valued in the world she'd chosen over her family. "Why are you here, Mrs. Dursley?" Hagrid asked gently. "Not that you're not welcome, mind, but it's not often we get visitors of the, non-magical persuasion." "I need to see Professor Dumbledore," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I have questions about Harry, about what happened to my sister, about promises that weren't kept." Hagrid's expression grew complicated. "Ah, well, that's complicated, that is." Before he could elaborate, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. A woman in dark robes was making her way through the trees, her greying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and her expression suggesting that she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Hagrid!" she called, her Scottish accent crisp with authority. "Professor Dumbledore sent me to see what was causing the disturbance in the wards. The magical signature suggested a Muggle had breached the—" She stopped mid-sentence as her eyes fell on Petunia, and her face went through the same series of expressions that Hagrid's had moments earlier. "Dear God," she whispered, "you're Lily Potter's sister." "Evans," Petunia corrected automatically. "Lily Evans Potter, perhaps, but she was born an Evans." Professor McGonagall, for this had to be McGonagall, the stern but fair teacher Lily had written about with such respect, approached slowly, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Petunia's appearance. "Mrs. Dursley," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected. I imagine it is." Petunia straightened to her full height, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "I've come to speak with Albus Dumbledore. I believe he and I have a great deal to discuss." McGonagall exchanged a meaningful look with Hagrid, a conversation passing between them in the space of a heartbeat. "Yes," she said at last, her voice heavy with something that might have been resignation or relief. "I rather think you do." Chapter 3. Ghosts in the Great Hall. The first thing that struck Petunia about Hogwarts Castle was how alive it felt. Not just inhabited, but genuinely alive, as though the stones themselves pulsed with centuries of accumulated magic. Following McGonagall through the massive oak doors, she found herself overwhelmed by sensory details that Lily's letters had mentioned, but never quite captured. The entrance hall soared above them, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to shift and dance without any visible light source. Torches flickered in brackets along the walls, their flames burning without smoke, and the air itself hummed with an energy that made the hair on Petunia's arms stand on end. "The castle is quieter this time of year," McGonagall said, her heels clicking against the stone floor with crisp authority. "We have perhaps 30 students remaining for the summer term, mostly those whose families felt they would be safer here than at home, given the current circumstances." The current circumstances. Petunia knew what that meant, even if the magical world preferred euphemisms to plain speaking. War had come to Britain again, and parents were choosing between keeping their children close or keeping them safe. "Lily wrote about the moving staircases," Petunia murmured, as they approached a grand staircase that was, indeed, slowly rotating to connect with a different landing. She said they had minds of their own. "That they do," McGonagall replied, waiting patiently for the staircase to complete its rotation. "Your sister had a particular talent for anticipating their movements. Most students spend their first month getting stranded on the wrong floors, but Lily seemed to understand their patterns almost immediately." They began to climb, and Petunia found herself gripping the banister more tightly than necessary. The staircase swayed gently as it moved, and portraits lining the walls had begun to whisper among themselves the moment they spotted her. "Is that? It must be. Look at the bone structure. Lily Evans's sister, without question. But what's she doing here? Perhaps she's finally come to her senses about magic." "Shh! Don't let Professor McGonagall hear you gossiping." Petunia tried to ignore the painted faces that turned to follow their progress, but their scrutiny was unnerving. Some of the portraits appeared to be former headmasters, judging by their elaborate robes and authoritative bearing, while others seemed to be random witches and wizards whose significance she couldn't fathom. "They remember everyone who walks these halls," McGonagall explained, noticing Petunia's discomfort. "Portraits have excellent memories for faces, and many of them were quite fond of your sister." As if summoned by her words, a translucent figure came drifting through the wall beside them. Petunia gasped and stumbled backward, nearly losing her footing on the moving staircase, but McGonagall's steady hand caught her elbow. "Sir Nicholas," McGonagall said with mild exasperation, "you're frightening our guest." The ghost, for that was clearly what he was, despite the impossibility of it, straightened his doublet and attempted what might have been a bow. The effect was somewhat undermined by the fact that his head lolled precariously to one side, barely attached to his neck by a thin strip of ghostly flesh. "My sincerest apologies, Professor," he said, in a voice that echoed like wind through empty chambers. "I simply had to see for myself if the rumors were true. Lily Evans's sister returned to Hogwarts at last. Nearly headless Nick," McGonagall said by way of introduction. "Meet Mrs. Petunia Dursley." "An honor, madam." The ghost's enthusiasm was palpable, despite his rather gruesome appearance. "Your sister was a particular favorite of mine during her time here. Such a kind girl, always willing to listen to my stories about the old days. She had a way of making even the most tedious historical anecdotes seem fascinating." Petunia found her voice, though it came out smaller than intended. "You knew her well?" "Indeed. She often sought me out when she needed a quiet space to think. The tower where I reside is peaceful, you see, and she would sit by the window writing letters." His expression grew suddenly melancholy. I was deeply saddened to learn of her passing. Such a tragedy, such a waste of a bright young life. The casual mention of Lily's death hit Petunia like a physical blow. She'd grown accustomed, over the years, to people tiptoeing around the subject, treating it as something too painful to acknowledge directly. But this ghost spoke of it with the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who had witnessed countless generations pass away. "Yes," she managed. "It was. Come along, Sir Nicholas," McGonagall said, gently but firmly. "Mrs. Dursley has business with the headmaster." They continued their ascent, passing through corridors lined with more portraits and tapestries that seemed to ripple with their own inner life. Petunia tried to absorb every detail, comparing what she saw to Lily's descriptions from decades past. The moving staircases, the talking portraits, the sense of ancient magic permeating every stone. It was all exactly as her sister had written, but experiencing it firsthand was overwhelming in ways she hadn't anticipated. "The Great Hall is just ahead," McGonagall said, as they approached a set of enormous double doors. "A few of our summer residents will be finishing their midday meal. I thought you might like to see where Harry takes his meals during term time." Petunia nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The mention of Harry sent a fresh wave of guilt and determination through her chest. She was here for him, as much as for Lily's memory. The Great Hall was even more magnificent than Lily's letters had suggested. 4 long tables stretched the length of the vast space, with a 5th table positioned perpendicular to them at the far end. The ceiling appeared to be open to the sky, showing patches of blue summer sky dotted with white clouds, though Petunia knew from Lily's descriptions that it was actually enchanted. "It's bewitched to look like the sky outside," she murmured, echoing words from a letter she'd read that morning. "You remember," McGonagall said, with something like approval. "Your sister always appreciated the ceiling. She once told me it made her feel less homesick during the darker months." At the Gryffindor table, identifiable by the red and gold banners hanging above it, perhaps a dozen students were scattered along its length, engaged in quiet conversations over their meal. Most appeared to be older students, 5th years and above, and they looked up with curious expressions as McGonagall led Petunia into the hall. "Is that Harry Potter's aunt?" one of them whispered, loudly enough to carry. "Must be. She looks exactly like he described her." "What's she doing here?" 2 students near the head of the table looked particularly shocked to see her. A girl with bushy brown hair and a boy with red hair and freckles, both of whom Petunia recognized from Harry's occasional, grudging descriptions of his school friends. "Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley," McGonagall said quietly, following her gaze. "Harry's closest friends. They've been staying at the castle this summer while their families make arrangements for their safety." Petunia approached the Gryffindor table slowly, her eyes drawn to a particular spot about halfway down its length, where the wood was worn smooth by years of use. She couldn't say how she knew, but something about that spot called to her. "Harry sits there," she said. It wasn't a question. "3rd seat from the corner." "Yes," McGonagall confirmed. "Has done since his first night here. Lily sat in almost exactly the same spot during her time as a student." Petunia reached out and touched the smooth wood, imagining her nephew eating his meals here, surrounded by friends and magic and all the things she'd denied him at home. For the first time, she tried to picture Harry not as the unwanted burden Vernon had convinced her he was, but as a young man building a life in the world his parents had loved. Mrs. Dursley, the bushy-haired girl, Hermione, had approached tentatively, her brown eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "Is everything all right? Is Harry? Harry is fine," Petunia said quickly, realizing that her unexpected appearance must be alarming to his friends. "I'm not here because of any emergency. I'm here because—" She paused, trying to find words that would encompass the complexity of her mission. "I'm here because it's time I learned about my nephew's other life." Ron Weasley had joined them, his expression wary but not hostile. "You mean you don't know about Hogwarts? About magic?" "Oh, I know about magic," Petunia said, her voice carrying more bitterness than she'd intended. "I've known about magic since I was 10 years old, and my sister received her Hogwarts letter. I just chose to pretend it didn't matter." The students exchanged meaningful glances, and Petunia realized that Harry must have told them about his home life. The thought made her stomach clench with shame. What had he said about her? About Vernon? About the 15 years they'd spent making him feel unwanted in their home? "Lily Evans's sister," said a voice from behind her, cultured and warm with recognition. "Miss Evans. It has been many years." Petunia turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd been preparing for this moment since she'd climbed into a car that morning, but nothing could have readied her for the reality of facing Albus Dumbledore. He was older than she'd expected, more fragile-looking, with long silver hair and a beard that nearly reached his waist. His blue eyes, magnified by half-moon spectacles, held a mixture of curiosity and what might have been guilt. He wore robes of midnight blue, decorated with silver stars, and despite his aged appearance, he radiated a power that made the air around him seem to thicken. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, pleased that her voice came out steady. "I was hoping we might have a conversation." "I imagine you were." His voice was grave, lacking the grandfatherly warmth she'd expected from Harry's descriptions. "I confess I have been wondering when this day might come." Petunia reached into her handbag and withdrew the stack of Lily's letters, holding them like a weapon. Around them, the great hall had gone completely silent, every student and faculty member present leaning forward to hear what would happen next. "These are my sister's letters," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "Every letter she wrote to me, from her first day at this school until 3 days before she died. 15 years' worth of correspondence that I kept but never properly read." Dumbledore's eyes fixed on the letters, and something in his expression shifted. "Ah. I read them this morning," Petunia continued, "and I have questions. Many, many questions about the promises you made to my sister, about the protection you offered her son, and about why the boy who was supposed to be your greatest triumph was left to grow up thinking he was unwanted and unloved." She held the letters higher, letting everyone present see them clearly. "We need to talk, Professor Dumbledore, and I think it's past time that conversation was a public one." The headmaster looked around the hall, taking in the rapt faces of students and staff, then back to Petunia with something that might have been resignation. "Very well, Miss Evans," he said quietly. "I believe we do indeed have much to discuss." Chapter 4. Letters of Fire and Truth. Dumbledore's office was a study in controlled chaos. Books lined every available surface. Strange silver instruments whirred and clicked on delicate tables, and portraits of former headmasters dozed in their frames with the studied indifference of those who had witnessed countless difficult conversations. But it was the phoenix perched behind the great desk that commanded Petunia's immediate attention. Fawkes was magnificent, a creature of scarlet and gold that seemed to burn with inner fire. As Petunia entered the circular room, the phoenix lifted his head and fixed her with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. Then, impossibly, he began to sing. The sound was unlike anything Petunia had ever heard. It wasn't merely beautiful, it was healing, a wordless expression of shared grief that resonated in her chest like a physical thing. For a moment, 15 years of carefully suppressed sorrow threatened to overwhelm her, and she found herself blinking back tears she hadn't expected to shed. "Fawkes senses your loss," Dumbledore said quietly, settling into the high-backed chair behind his desk. "Phoenix song is particularly attuned to grief, especially grief that has been carried alone for too long." Petunia remained standing, clutching Lily's letters to her chest like armor. "I didn't come here for sympathy, Professor Dumbledore. I came for answers." "I rather suspected you had." The headmaster gestured to a chair across from his desk, but Petunia shook her head. She needed to maintain every advantage she could, and height was one of them. "These letters," she began, laying the stack on his desk with deliberate care, "tell a story. A story about a young witch who trusted you completely, who believed you when you said you would protect the people she loved, who died believing that her sacrifice would keep her son safe." Dumbledore's eyes, usually twinkling with hidden humor, had grown grave. Lily was a remarkable young woman. Her loss was— "Don't!" Petunia's voice cut across his words like a blade. "Don't you dare sit there and speak of her loss as though it was some tragic accident. Not when I have her own words proving otherwise." She picked up the first letter, dated September 1971, written in the careful script of an 11-year-old girl desperate to maintain connection with her only sister. "Dear Tuny," she read aloud, "I know you're angry with me for leaving, but I had to write and tell you about the most amazing thing. The headmaster, Professor Dumbledore, spoke to all the new students tonight. He said that Hogwarts would become our home, and that we would find ourselves changed by the magic we learned here. But he also said something else, Tuny. He said that the greatest magic of all was the love we carried for our families, and that love would always call us home. I thought you should know that, even if I'm learning magic, you're still my home." Dumbledore's expression had softened, but Petunia wasn't finished. "She believed you," she continued, setting the first letter aside and reaching for another. "She trusted every word you said about love and protection and family. And you used that trust, didn't you?" The second letter was dated March 1975, written in a more mature hand that still carried Lily's distinctive loops and flourishes. "Tuny, I know you haven't answered any of my letters this year, but I have to tell someone, and you're the only family I have left. 3 students died last week, murdered by the Dark Lord's followers, just for being Muggle-born like me. Professor Dumbledore says the war is spreading, that we all have to make choices about what we're willing to sacrifice for the greater good. I'm scared, Tuny. I'm scared and I miss you, and I don't understand why loving magic means I had to lose my sister." Petunia's voice had grown stronger with each word, and she saw Dumbledore flinch at the pain in Lily's young voice. "She was 17 years old when she wrote that," Petunia said. 17, and already you were filling her head with talk of sacrifice and the greater good, already grooming her to die for your cause." "Mrs. Dursley," Dumbledore began, but she held up her hand. "I'm not finished." The third letter was dated June 1978, written on wedding stationery that made Petunia's heart ache with memory. "Dear Petunia, James and I are to be married next month. I know you probably won't come. I know you disapprove of our world and everything in it, but I had to invite you anyway. You're my sister, Tuny. You're the only sister I'll ever have, and I want you to know that I love you, despite everything. James says I should stop writing to someone who clearly doesn't want to hear from me, but Professor Dumbledore says that love persists even when it's not returned. He says that someday, when the war is over, you and I might find our way back to each other. I hope he's right. I hope there's still time." The silence that followed was deafening. Even Fawkes had stopped singing, fixing Dumbledore with an accusatory stare that seemed to echo Petunia's growing fury. "There's still time," she repeated bitterly. How could you let her believe there was still time when you already knew how this would end? "Petunia." "No." She slammed the fourth letter onto the desk with enough force to rattle the delicate silver instruments. "Listen to what she wrote when Harry was born." This letter was different, hastily written, the ink slightly smeared as though Lily had been crying while she wrote it. "Tuny, I had my baby yesterday. A son. Harry James Potter. And he's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. James is completely besotted, and I think even Professor Snape smiled when he held Harry for the first time. But Tuny, I need you to know something. Professor Dumbledore came to see me this afternoon, and he told me about a prophecy. He says Harry might be in terrible danger, that the Dark Lord will come for him. I'm so frightened, Tuny. I keep thinking about when we were little, how you used to protect me from the older children at the playground. I wish you could protect Harry too. I wish things were different between us. If something happens to me, if James and I don't survive this war, please don't let them make Harry feel as unloved as you've made me feel. He deserves better than that. He deserves a family who wants him. Petunia's hands were shaking as she set the letter down. She knew, didn't she? Even then, she knew you were going to let her die. The prophecy required nothing. Petunia's voice rose to near shouting, and several portraits stirred in their frames. The prophecy gave you an excuse to do what you were already planning, to use my sister as bait in your war against Voldemort. She reached for the final letter, the one that had haunted her dreams for 15 years. October 28th, 1981, she read, her voice deadly quiet. 3 days before she died. Tuny, this will probably be my last letter to you. The Dark Lord has found us. We're hidden under a spell called the Fidelius Charm. But I don't think it will hold much longer. Professor Dumbledore says that if Voldemort comes for Harry, my love will protect him in ways that magic cannot. He says that a mother's sacrifice, freely given, creates protection more powerful than any charm or ward. I understand now why you stopped writing to me, Tuny. You knew, somehow, that loving me would only lead to heartbreak. But I can't stop loving you, any more than I can stop loving James or Harry. If I die tomorrow, know that I forgive you for everything, and know that I'm trusting you with the most precious thing in my life. Take care of my son, Tunya. Love him if you can. And if you can't love him, at least don't let him grow up thinking he wasn't wanted. The letter fluttered from her nerveless fingers to land on Dumbledore's desk like an accusation. The old wizard had gone completely still, his hands folded before him, and his eyes fixed on some point beyond Petunia's shoulder. She knew she was going to die, Petunia whispered. She knew it, and she went to her death willingly, because you convinced her it was necessary, because you told her that her sacrifice would protect Harry, would keep him safe, and loved and cherished. She laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Safe and loved. Do you know what Harry's life has been like, Professor? Do you know how we've treated the son of the woman who died believing her sacrifice would matter? Dumbledore finally looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something that might have been shame in his ancient eyes. The protection required Lily's willing sacrifice, he said quietly. It required her to choose death over life, love over self-preservation. And yes, Mrs. Dursley, I knew that choice would eventually be asked of her. You used her, Petunia said flatly. You used her love for Harry, her trust in you, her desperate hope that her death would mean something. You turned my sister into a weapon and pointed her at Voldemort, knowing she would die in the process. I did what was necessary to win your war. Petunia's control finally snapped, and she leaned across his desk like an avenging angel. You sacrificed my sister for the greater good, and then you dumped her traumatized, orphaned son on the doorstep of people who had every reason to resent him. You knew what we were like, Professor. You knew how Vernon felt about magic, how I felt about the sister who chose your world over her family. And you left Harry with us anyway, because his suffering was part of your plan too, wasn't it? Dumbledore's silence was answer enough. You never intended for Harry to be happy, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrible than her earlier shouting. You intended for him to be a weapon, just like his mother. Broken and desperate and willing to die for your cause, because that's the only kind of love he'd ever known. She straightened, gathering the letters with hands that had stopped shaking. Well, Professor Dumbledore, I'm here to tell you that your plan has failed. Harry Potter may be your weapon, but he is also Lily Evans's son, and Lily Evans's sister is done letting you use her family for your wars. The old wizard looked up at her with eyes that held the weight of a century's worth of difficult choices. What do you propose to do, Mrs. Dursley? Petunia smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. I propose to give you exactly what my sister thought she was buying with her life. I propose to give Harry Potter a family that wants him. She turned toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. And, Professor, if you try to stop me, I will make sure that every parent in the wizarding world knows exactly what you did to Lily Potter. I will make sure they understand that your greater good requires their children to die unloved and afraid. Let's see how many of them are willing to make that sacrifice once they know the truth. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Dumbledore alone with his phoenix and the weight of 15 years' worth of choices that could never be undone. Chapter 5. The Price of Protection. The silence in Dumbledore's office stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the soft ticking of the silver instruments and Fawkes's occasional rustle of feathers. Petunia stood frozen with her hand on the door handle, her ultimatum hanging in the air between them like an unsheathed blade. Wait, Dumbledore said quietly, and something in his voice made her pause. Please, if you truly wish to understand what was done and why, then you deserve to know the complete truth. The truth about the protection that has kept Harry alive for 15 years. Against her better judgment, Petunia found herself turning back toward his desk. What about it? Sit, Dumbledore said, and this time it was not a request. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you have earned the right to know. Petunia remained standing, but she moved closer to his desk, her arms crossed defensively across her chest. Explain. Dumbledore steepled his fingers, his blue eyes fixed on some point beyond her shoulder. The protection your sister's sacrifice created is unlike any magic known to wizardkind. It lives in Harry's blood, yes, but it also lives in yours. In mine? The words came out sharper than intended. Blood protection requires more than sacrifice, Dumbledore continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a professor, delivering a difficult lesson. It requires ongoing connection to the family line. As long as Harry could call the place where his mother's blood dwells home, he remained protected from Voldemort's direct touch. Petunia felt something cold settle in her stomach. You mean as long as he lived with me? Precisely. Dumbledore's eyes met hers, and she saw something that might have been regret flickering in their depths. But the magic required more than mere residence, Mrs. Dursley. It required authenticity. Authenticity? The protection was strongest when Harry truly felt unwanted, truly believed himself to be a burden. The words fell from Dumbledore's lips like stones into still water. When he genuinely wished to be elsewhere, to be anyone other than who he was, the magic interpreted his suffering as proof that Privet Drive was not his chosen home, but his only refuge. The worse he felt there, the more tightly the protection bound him to your bloodline. The cold in Petunia's stomach spread outward, numbing her fingers and making her legs feel suddenly unsteady. You're saying that Harry had to be miserable for the magic to work. I am saying that Harry's unhappiness strengthened the bonds that kept him alive. Dumbledore's voice was carefully neutral, but his hands had begun to tremble slightly. The magic fed on his sense of not belonging, his certainty that he was unwanted. It transformed his emotional isolation into a fortress that Voldemort could never breach. Petunia sank into the chair she had refused earlier, her mind reeling. The way Vernon treated him, the The way we all treated him. You knew. You knew it would happen. And you wanted it to happen. I knew it was likely, Dumbledore admitted. When I placed Harry in your care, I was aware of your husband's antipathy toward magic and your own complicated feelings about your sister. I calculated that these factors would create the precise emotional environment the protection required. You calculated. Petunia's voice came out as a whisper. You turned our family dysfunction into a magical battery, and you calculated that it would work. Mrs. Dursley? What about the times when I thought about being kinder to him? The memories were flooding back now. Moments over the years when she'd seen something of Lily in Harry's expression, when maternal instinct had almost overwhelmed her resentment. There were moments when I wanted to treat him better. Were those magically suppressed? Yes. Dumbledore's admission hit her like a physical blow. The protection recognized any genuine affection you felt for Harry as a threat to its integrity. It dampened those impulses, encouraged your natural resentment, fed your anger at being burdened with a child you had not chosen. Petunia felt bile rise in her throat. You made me hate him. You made me cruel to a child who had done nothing wrong, and you did it with magic. The magic amplified tendencies that were already present, Dumbledore said carefully. It did not create emotions that did not exist, but it certainly encouraged certain responses over others. 15 years, she breathed, her hands clenching into fists. 15 years of treating him like something we scraped off our shoes, and it was all part of your plan. Did Mrs. Figg know? When she was watching him, reporting back to you, did she know that his suffering was intentional? Dumbledore's silence was answer enough. She knew, Petunia said flatly. She watched us neglect him, watched Vernon lock him in that cupboard, watched him grow up thinking he was worthless, and she reported it all back to you, like it was good news. Arabella Figg's reports confirmed that the protection remained strong, Dumbledore said. They also confirmed that Harry, while certainly not happy, was in no immediate physical danger. No immediate physical danger? Petunia's voice climbed toward hysteria. He was skin and bones when he came home from Hogwarts each summer. We locked him in a room with bars on the windows. Vernon used to— She broke off, unable to voice the full extent of her husband's cruelty. And you knew all of it, and you let it continue because it made your magic work better. The protection saved his life on numerous occasions, Dumbledore said quietly. Voldemort's agents could not find him, could not touch him, could not harm him in any lasting way. That protection has been worth the price. Worth the price? Petunia shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Harry Potter's childhood was the price. His happiness, his sense of self-worth, his ability to trust or love or believe himself worthy of either. That was the price. And you paid it without a moment's hesitation, because it suited your grand strategy. She began to pace, her hand shaking with rage. How many other children have you sacrificed on the altar of the greater good? Dumbledore's face had gone completely grey. I have made many difficult choices in my long life, Mrs. Dursley. Some of them have required— How many? She demanded. The Longbottoms, he said finally. Neville's parents. They could have been hidden, protected, kept safe. But they made excellent bait for Voldemort's inner circle. And the Bones family. Susan's parents and siblings. Edgar Bones was a powerful aura who could have gone into hiding. Instead, I convinced him to remain visible, to continue fighting, knowing he would draw attacks that might otherwise target less prepared families. Petunia felt sick. You used them all. I used their willingness to sacrifice for others, Dumbledore corrected. I asked nothing of them that they were not prepared to give. You asked nothing. The voice came from the doorway, cold and sharp as winter wind. You asked nothing, old man? Petunia spun toward the entrance, where a tall, thin man in black robes stood silhouetted against the corridor beyond. His dark hair hung like curtains around a pale, angular face, and his black eyes glittered with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Severus," Dumbledore said, and there was warning in his voice. This is not what, Albus?" "The man. Snape. It had to be Snape," the potions master Lily had written about, stepped into the room and let the door close behind him with a soft click. "This is not the time for honesty. This is not the moment to admit what you've done." His gaze fell on Petunia, and his eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Petunia Evans," he said, his voice carrying the faint trace of an accent she remembered from her childhood in Cokeworth. "It has been many years since I've seen Lily's sister." "Professor Snape." She inclined her head stiffly. "Though I suppose I should thank you. Lily wrote about you quite often in her early letters. You were her first friend in your world." Something flickered across Snape's face. Pain, perhaps, or regret. "And I was the one who lost her to it," he said quietly, just as Albus was the one who ensured her death served his purposes. "Severus!" Dumbledore's voice carried a sharp note of warning. "No, Albus." Snape moved to stand beside Petunia, an unlikely alliance forming in the face of their shared grief. "Miss Evans has come seeking truth about her sister's death and her nephew's suffering. Perhaps it is time she learned how thoroughly you have manipulated both." He turned to face Petunia directly. "Did he tell you about the monitoring charms on Privet Drive, the magical sensors that recorded every moment of Harry's misery and transmitted the data directly to this office?" Petunia's mouth fell open. "What?" "Oh, yes," Snape continued, his voice dripping with bitter satisfaction. "Albus didn't simply trust to chance that Harry would be sufficiently miserable. He monitored the boy's emotional state constantly, adjusting variables when necessary to maintain optimal suffering levels." "That's enough, Severus," Dumbledore said, his voice sharp with authority. "Is it?" Snape's eyes glittered dangerously. "Is it enough, when this woman has spent 15 years unknowingly torturing a child for your benefit? Is it enough, when she deserves to understand exactly how thoroughly she has been used?" He turned back to Petunia, his expression almost gentle despite the harshness of his words. "There were times when your natural affection for the boy threatened to break through the magical suppression. Do you remember them? Brief moments when you looked at Harry and saw Lily's son rather than an unwanted burden?" Petunia nodded mutely, remembering those fleeting instances of warmth that had always seemed to evaporate as quickly as they came. "Those moments triggered alarms in this very office," Snape continued relentlessly. "Within hours you would receive anonymous complaints about Harry's behavior, or Vernon would have an unusually bad day at work and take his frustrations out on the boy, or some other catalyst would arrive to restore the proper emotional climate. The room seemed to spin around Petunia as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. "Everything," she whispered, "everything was orchestrated." "Not everything," Snape said with bitter precision. "Your husband's fundamental nature required no enhancement. But the timing, the intensity, the prevention of any genuine bonding between you and the boy. Yes, Miss Evans. All of it was carefully managed." Petunia looked at Dumbledore, who had gone completely still behind his desk. "Is it true?" The old wizard's silence stretched for what felt like hours before he finally spoke. Harry Potter's survival required absolute certainty that the protection would hold. I could not afford to leave such things to chance. "You destroyed him," she said, her voice barely audible. "You destroyed a child to serve your war, and you made me complicit in it." "I saved the wizarding world," Dumbledore replied, but his words lacked their usual conviction. "No," Petunia said, rising from her chair with newfound purpose. "You may have won your war, Professor, but you did it by sacrificing everything decent and good about the people you claimed to protect, including Harry." She moved toward the door, her decision crystallizing with each step. "But that ends now. Harry is coming home with me today. Really home, not to the prison you turned Privet Drive into." "The protection," Dumbledore began. "The protection was built on lies and cruelty," she interrupted. "If it can't survive honesty and love, then perhaps it was never worth having in the first place." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. 15 years, Professor. 15 years of my life you stole to serve your vision of the greater good. I'm taking back what's left of my family, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have making up for what you made me do to my sister's son." The door closed behind her, with a finality that echoed through the circular room, leaving Dumbledore and Snape alone with the weight of their choices and the growing certainty that the carefully constructed order they had maintained for 15 years was beginning to crumble at last. Chapter 6. When Foundations Crack. Professor McGonagall had not meant to eavesdrop. She had been approaching Dumbledore's office to discuss the summer curriculum arrangements when raised voices from within had stopped her in her tracks. Now, pressed against the cold stone wall beside the gargoyle that guarded the entrance, she found herself trembling with a combination of rage and vindication that she hadn't felt in decades. 15 years, she whispered to herself, echoing Petunia Dursley's words. 15 years of watching that boy return to school thinner and more withdrawn each year, and I said nothing. But she had suspected. Dear God, how she had suspected. The careful way Harry flinched from unexpected touch, the gratitude in his eyes when shown the smallest kindness, the way he hoarded food in his first year, as though he expected it to be taken away. She had attributed it to the trauma of losing his parents, to the adjustment of living with Muggles who didn't understand magic. She had never imagined it was orchestrated. The gargoyle sprang aside as footsteps approached from within, and McGonagall quickly stepped back into the shadows. Petunia Dursley emerged first, her face set in lines of determination that transformed her pinched features into something almost regal. Behind her came Professor Snape, his usual sneer replaced by an expression of grim satisfaction. "Miss Evans," he said quietly, as they walked past McGonagall's hiding place. "I believe this conversation is far from over." "Mrs. Dursley," Petunia corrected automatically, but there was no real heat in it. "And you're right. It's time the rest of the magical world heard what their hero has been doing to win their war." McGonagall waited until their footsteps had faded before stepping into the corridor, her mind racing. She needed to think, needed to process what she had heard. But first she needed to ensure that certain people learned the truth before Dumbledore could spin it to his advantage. Her first stop was the library, where she found Hermione Granger and Ron Weasley huddled over what appeared to be a potions text, but was probably something far more interesting concealed beneath it. They looked up guiltily as she approached, clearly expecting to be chastised for their poor choice in recreational reading. "Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley," she said without preamble. "I need you to send word to Harry immediately. Tell him his aunt has come to Hogwarts and that he needs to be here as quickly as possible." Both students stared at her in shock. "Harry's aunt?" Hermione repeated. "Aunt Petunia?" But she hates magic. She'd never come to Hogwarts voluntarily. Nevertheless, she is here, and she has had a most illuminating conversation with the headmaster about Harry's upbringing. McGonagall's voice was crisp with barely controlled anger. "I believe Mr. Potter deserves to hear what was discussed." Ron had gone very pale. "Professor, is Harry in trouble? Did something happen to the Dursleys?" "The Dursleys are fine, Mr. Weasley. Whether Harry is in trouble remains to be seen." She paused, studying their worried faces. "How quickly can you reach him?" "Hedwig's in the owlery," Hermione said, already rising from her chair. "But Professor, what's this about? You look—" "I look like someone who has just learned that she has been complicit in a terrible injustice for 15 years, McGonagall said flatly. "Now go. Send that owl, and tell Harry that his aunt is demanding answers about his treatment at Privet Drive." The students exchanged a meaningful look that spoke volumes about what they knew of Harry's home life, then hurried from the library with more speed than McGonagall had seen from them since their last potions exam. Meanwhile, word was spreading through the castle with the peculiar efficiency of institutional gossip. By the time McGonagall reached the Great Hall, clusters of students were engaged in animated conversations punctuated by frequent glances toward the head table. "Is it true a Muggle woman drove onto the grounds? I heard she demanded to see Dumbledore about Harry Potter. My dad says Muggles can't even find Hogwarts. How did she get through the wards? She must be really angry to risk coming here. I mean, it's Harry's aunt, right? The one who treats him like dirt?" McGonagall winced at that last comment, spoken with the casual cruelty of adolescence. How many students knew about Harry's home life? How many of them had simply accepted it as another quirk of the famous Harry Potter's complicated existence? The Floo network in McGonagall's office flared green as she entered, depositing Remus Lupin onto her hearth in a shower of emerald flames. He brushed soot from his shabby robes and looked up at her with concerned amber eyes. "Minerva, I got your message. What's this about Petunia Dursley being at Hogwarts?" "It's about a great many things, Remus," she replied grimly. "And I suspect we're going to need more Order members here before this is resolved. How quickly can you reach Tonks and Moody?" "They're already on their way. When word reached Grimmauld Place that a Dursley had breached Hogwarts's defences, most of us assumed the worst." Lupin sank into the chair across from her desk, looking older than his years. "What has she said to Albus?" McGonagall was spared from answering by another flare of green flame. Nymphadora Tonks stumbled out of the fireplace, her hair cycling through several colours before settling on a worried brown that matched her eyes. "Professor McGonagall," she said breathlessly, "is it true? Has Harry's aunt really—" A third arrival cut off her question as Alastair Moody's scarred form emerged from the flames, his magical eye spinning wildly as it surveyed the room for threats. "Constant vigilance!" he bellowed automatically, then seemed to focus on the situation at hand. "Where's the Dursley woman? And where's Potter?" "Harry is being summoned from Privet Drive," McGonagall said. "As for Mrs. Dursley, I believe she is currently in the kitchens." "The kitchens?" Tonks looked confused. "Why would she go there?" McGonagall's smile was grim. "Because, my dear, the house elves have excellent memories, and they remember every student who ever showed them kindness. Lily Evans was apparently quite beloved below stairs." Indeed, when the Order members made their way to the kitchens, they found Petunia surrounded by house elves in various states of emotional distress. Dobby, still wearing his collection of mismatched clothes, was wringing a tea towel and looking ready to burst into tears. "Oh, Miss Lily's sister has come at last," he was saying. "Dobby is remembering Miss Lily so clearly. She was always kind to house elves, always saying please and thank you, even when other students did not bother." An elderly elf with drooping ears was nodding vigorously. Miss Lily would come to kitchens when she was sad. Yes, she would. She would sit with Creeley and drink tea and tell Creeley about her sister who did not understand magic. Creeley is thinking Miss Lily's sister understands magic very well now, yes? Petunia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She talked about me." "Oh yes, miss. Miss Lily was always hoping her sister would write back to her letters. She was telling us that her sister was protecting herself by staying away from magic, but that love was stronger than fear, and someday her sister would understand. Lily was wiser than I gave her credit for," Petunia murmured, then looked up as the Order members entered. "Professor Lupin, I presume? And Miss Tonks? Harry has mentioned you both." Lupin stepped forward, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Dursley. This is unexpected." "I imagine it is." Petunia rose from the small stool the elves had provided, her composure returning as she faced the adults who had been managing Harry's life. "I suppose you're here to convince me to return quietly to little whinging and pretend this conversation never happened." "Actually," Tonks said, her hair shifting to a determined purple, I'm here because I want to know what the bloody hell Dumbledore has been thinking all these years. Moody's magical eye fixed on Petunia with uncomfortable intensity. You've got information about Potter's treatment at your home. Information that's got Dumbledore worried enough to call in the cavalry. Information? Petunia laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Professor Moody, I have 15 years' worth of information about what your precious headmaster has been doing to Harry Potter in the name of protection. The question is whether any of you are prepared to hear it. Lupin's face had gone very pale. Petunia, what has Albus told you? He's told me that every moment of cruelty Harry suffered in my house was carefully orchestrated and magically maintained to keep him alive. She met each of their eyes in turn. He's told me that my sister died believing her sacrifice would protect her son, when in reality it condemned him to 15 years of systematic emotional abuse designed to feed a protection ward that required his misery to function. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the house elves had stopped their bustling to stare at the assembled adults with wide, horrified eyes. That's... Tonks began, then stopped, her hair cycling rapidly through colors of distress. That's monstrous, Lupin finished quietly. Even for Albus, that's tactically sound, Moody said gruffly, though his expression suggested he found no satisfaction in the admission. Brutal, but sound. If Potter's suffering was the price of keeping him alive. His suffering was the price of keeping Dumbledore's war strategy intact, Petunia interrupted sharply. There's a difference, Professor Moody. One suggests necessity. The other suggests choice. McGonagall, who had been silent during the exchange, finally spoke. There will be a full order meeting within the hour, she announced. Mrs. Dursley has agreed to share her information with all of us, so that we might make informed decisions about Harry's future. And if Dumbledore refuses to call such a meeting? Lupin asked. McGonagall's smile was sharp as broken glass. Then I will call it myself. I am, after all, deputy headmistress of this school, and a founding member of the Order of the Phoenix. I think I have sufficient authority to demand answers about the treatment of a student under our care. Another flare of green flame announced a new arrival, and Harry Potter himself stepped out of McGonagall's temporary flu connection, looking confused and more than a little apprehensive. His eyes found Petunia immediately, widening in shock. Aunt Petunia? What are you doing here? Is everything all right? Is Dudley? Dudley is fine, Harry, she said gently, and the kindness in her voice made him take a step backward in surprise. I'm here because it's time someone asked the right questions about your life, about what's been done to you, and why. Harry looked around at the assembled Order members, taking in their grim expressions and the way they seemed to be avoiding his eyes. What's going on? What's going on? Petunia said, moving to stand beside her nephew in a gesture of solidarity that shocked everyone present, including herself. Is that we're going to have a conversation with the people who've been making decisions about your life. And for the first time in 15 years, you're going to have a voice in those decisions. She looked around at the Order members, her chin raised in challenge. The question is whether the rest of you are brave enough to hear what Harry Potter has to say about the childhood you all helped arrange for him. The kitchen fell silent, except for the nervous chittering of house elves and the distant sound of students in the corridors above. In that silence, the foundations of everything they had believed about their cause began to crack, and the sound was deafening. Chapter 7. The Testimony of Lily Evans. The great hall had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, though Petunia suspected the comparison was more apt than anyone realized. The 4 house tables had been moved aside, replaced by a semicircle of chairs facing a single seat where she now sat, Lily's letters arranged in chronological order on a small table beside her. The enchanted ceiling showed gathering storm clouds that seemed to mirror the tension in the room below. Dumbledore sat directly across from her, his usually twinkling eyes subdued behind his half-moon spectacles. To his left, the assembled order members filled the remaining chairs, faces she recognized from Harry's descriptions and others she was meeting for the first time. Molly Weasley sat with her husband Arthur, her round face already flushed with the kind of maternal anger that Petunia recognized in herself. Professor McGonagall had positioned herself pointedly apart from Dumbledore, her tartan robes a stark contrast to his star-spangled blue. Harry sat in the front row, flanked by Hermione and Ron, who had been permitted to stay as his closest friends. He looked younger than his 16 years, overwhelmed by finding himself at the center of a conflict he was only beginning to understand. "Mrs. Dursley," McGonagall said formally, "you have requested this gathering to present evidence regarding the treatment of Harry Potter during his time in your custody. Please proceed." Petunia rose, surprised by how steady her voice sounded when she spoke. "Thank you, Professor McGonagall. What I have to share with you are the words of my sister, Lily Evans Potter, written over the course of 11 years from her arrival at Hogwarts until 3 days before her death. These letters tell a story of manipulation, calculated sacrifice, and the systematic grooming of a young witch to die for a cause that used her love as a weapon." She picked up the first letter, dated September 1971. "This is what my 11-year-old sister wrote after her first night at Hogwarts." As she read Lily's eager descriptions of the magical world, of Dumbledore's welcoming speech and his emphasis on love and family, she watched the faces of her audience. Most looked puzzled, uncertain why she was starting with such innocent content. "By itself, this letter means nothing," Petunia continued. "It's the words of a child excited to share her new world with her sister. But context matters. Professor Dumbledore, would you tell this assembly when you first became aware of the prophecy that would shape Harry Potter's life?" Dumbledore's fingers steepled before him. The prophecy was made in 1979, when Lily was 18 years old. "And yet," Petunia said, reaching for a letter dated 1975, "4 years before that prophecy was made, my sister was already writing about sacrifice and the greater good. She was 17 when she wrote this." She read the passage about students dying, about Dumbledore's talk of sacrifice, and watched Molly Weasley's face grow progressively paler. "She was just a child," Molly whispered, her voice carrying across the silent hall. 17 years old, and already you were talking to her about dying for the cause." "The war required," Dumbledore began. "The war required soldiers," Arthur Weasley interrupted, his usually mild voice sharp with something approaching anger. "Not children convinced that their deaths were noble necessities. There are laws, Albus, about the recruitment of minors into dangerous organizations." Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had been silent until now, leaned forward in his chair. "Arthur's right. What you're describing sounds dangerously close to indoctrination of a minor. That's illegal under both magical and Muggle law." Petunia felt a surge of gratitude toward these adults who were finally asking the questions she'd been desperate to voice. "It gets worse," she said quietly, reaching for the next letter. This was written in 1978, when Lily announced her engagement to James Potter. As she read Lily's words about Dumbledore's influence on their relationship, about his assurances that love would conquer all, Remus Lupin made a sound that might have been a sob. "I remember that conversation," he said hoarsely. "James came to me afterwards, troubled by something Dumbledore had said about their future children, about how powerful their offspring might be, and how that power would be needed in the coming war." "You knew?" Harry spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice cracking with betrayal. "You knew they were planning to use me before I was even born?" Lupin looked at him with eyes full of pain. "I suspected, Harry, but I told myself I was reading too much into casual comments. I wanted to believe that Albus had your parents' happiness at heart." "Professor Dumbledore had everyone's happiness at heart," Snape said, his voice dripping with bitter sarcasm. "Just not in the way they imagined. He collected loyal followers by making them feel chosen, special, essential to his grand design. And when the time came for them to pay the price of that specialness, they went willingly to their deaths, believing they were heroes. Petunia read the letter announcing Harry's birth, with its undercurrent of fear and Lily's growing awareness that her son was in danger. "She trusted you," she said to Dumbledore. "Even when she was terrified, even when she knew her life was at risk, she trusted you to protect her baby." "And he was protected," Dumbledore said quietly. "Harry survived when Voldemort could not have been defeated by any other means." "Harry survived," Tonks said, her hair flashing an angry red. "But at what cost? You're talking about him like he's a strategy rather than a person." "Sometimes," Dumbledore replied, "the greater good requires—" "No." The word cracked through the hall like a whip as Petunia rose to her feet. "No, you don't get to hide behind the greater good anymore. Not when I have my sister's final letter to prove what that philosophy actually cost." She lifted the last letter with hands that shook only slightly. "October 28th, 1981. 3 days before Halloween. 3 days before you let my sister die." As she read Lily's final words, her forgiveness, her trust, her desperate hope that her son would be loved, the silence in the great hall became absolute. Even the ghosts seemed to have stopped their eternal wandering to listen. "She forgave me," Petunia whispered when she finished reading. "She forgave me for wars of cruelty and silence, and she asked me to love her son. And what did I do? I spent 15 years making that boy feel as unwanted and unloved as possible, because your magic made me. The protection required—" Dumbledore started again. "The protection required nothing!" Molly Weasley exploded, rising from her chair like an avenging angel. "I've raised 7 children, Albus Dumbledore, and I know the difference between protective magic and deliberate cruelty. What you describe isn't protection, it's torture." Arthur placed a steadying hand on his wife's arm, but didn't contradict her words. "How many others, Albus? How many other families have paid prices they didn't know they were agreeing to?" "The Longbottoms," McGonagall said suddenly, her voice hollow with realization. "Frank and Alice could have been hidden, but you convinced them to stay visible, to draw attacks away from other families. Neville lost his parents for the greater good." "The Bones family," Kingsley added grimly. "Edgar was one of my best aurors. We could have protected him, given him a new identity, moved his family abroad. Instead, I asked him to maintain his profile, to continue fighting openly." Dumbledore's voice had grown very quiet, "because his visibility drew Voldemort's attention away from less prepared targets." "You used them all," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone who trusted you, everyone who believed in your cause, you turned them into bait." "I made difficult choices in difficult times," Dumbledore replied, "choices that saved thousands of lives." "Lily trusted you with her son," Petunia said, moving to stand behind Harry's chair in a gesture of protection that surprised them both. "She didn't trust you with her sacrifice. She thought her death would buy Harry a happy, safe childhood, surrounded by people who would cherish him for who he was, not what he could do for your war effort." She looked around the assembled Order members, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "The question now is what you're going to do about it. Are you going to continue following a leader who treats children like chess pieces? Or are you going to give Harry Potter what his mother actually died for? The right to choose his own fate?" McGonagall was the first to speak. "I call for a vote of no confidence in Albus Dumbledore's guardianship of Harry Potter." "Seconded," Molly Weasley said immediately. "All in favour?" McGonagall asked. Hands rose around the semicircle. McGonagall, both Weasleys, Tonks, Kingsley, even Lupin, after a moment of internal struggle. Snape's hand remained lowered, but he spoke into the silence. "I abstain," he said quietly. My judgment regarding anything connected to Lily Evans cannot be trusted to be objective. Those opposed, McGonagall continued. Only 2 hands rose, Dumbledore's own and that of Mad-Eye Moody, who gruffly explained, "Don't like the precedent of questioning field decisions during wartime. Sets a dangerous standard." "The motion carries," McGonagall announced. "Albus Dumbledore is hereby removed from any decision-making authority regarding Harry Potter's welfare, living arrangements, or future plans." She turned to Harry, her expression softening. "Mr. Potter, you are 16 years old enough to have a voice in your own destiny. Who would you choose as your guardian?" Harry looked up at Petunia, standing behind his chair like a protective barrier between him and the adults who had been managing his life. For the first time in 15 years, someone was asking him what he wanted instead of telling him what was necessary. "I choose my aunt," he said clearly. "I choose family." Petunia's hand came to rest on his shoulder, and for the first time since she was 10 years old and learned her sister was a witch, magic felt like something that might heal rather than harm. "Then it's settled," McGonagall said with satisfaction. "Mrs. Dursley, Harry Potter is officially in your custody. I trust you will do better by him than we have." Looking down at her nephew, Lily's son, who had his mother's courage and his father's stubborn loyalty, Petunia smiled. "Yes," she said simply. "I will." Chapter 8. The Boy Who Lived to Choose. Harry Potter had lived through a lot of difficult conversations in his 16 years, but none had prepared him for sitting across from his aunt in an empty classroom at Hogwarts, while she explained how thoroughly his entire life had been orchestrated. The late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the desk between them, and Harry found himself focusing on the dancing dust motes rather than meeting her eyes. "I need you to understand something, Harry," Petunia said quietly, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "When I was cruel to you, when I let Vernon treat you the way he did, when I made you feel unwanted and unloved, part of me always knew it was wrong. There were moments, especially when you were younger, when I would look at you and see Lily so clearly it took my breath away." Harry's jaw clenched. "But you did it anyway." "Yes," she said simply. "I did it anyway. And now I know why those moments of wanting to be kind to you always seemed to slip away, why the anger always felt stronger than any sympathy. Dumbledore's magic made sure of that." "Magic?" Harry laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Everything always comes back to magic, doesn't it? Even when it's ruining lives, even when it's torturing children, it's still supposed to be this wonderful, amazing thing that makes everything better." Petunia leaned forward slightly, and Harry was surprised to see tears in her eyes. "Magic didn't ruin your life, Harry. I did. Vernon did. We made choices, and the fact that those choices were magically encouraged doesn't absolve us of the responsibility for making them. Doesn't it?" Harry's voice was sharper than he'd intended. "If Dumbledore's magic was pushing you to hate me, if it was suppressing any kindness you might have felt, then how can you be responsible for—" "Because I remember those moments of kindness," Petunia interrupted. "I remember wanting to comfort you when you had nightmares, wanting to celebrate your birthday, wanting to tell you stories about your mother. And I remember choosing not to do those things because it was easier to resent you than to love you." The words hit Harry like a physical blow. He'd spent years telling himself that his relatives' cruelty was simply their nature, that he was fundamentally unlovable to anyone who wasn't forced to tolerate him by magic or circumstance. The idea that Petunia had actively chosen cruelty over kindness somehow hurt worse than believing she was incapable of caring about him. "Why?" The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why was it easier to hate me?" Petunia was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Because loving you would have meant admitting how much I missed your mother, how much I regretted the choices I made, the letters I didn't answer, the bridge I burned between us out of jealousy and fear. She looked up at him then, and Harry saw something in her expression he'd never seen before. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. "I loved Lily more than anyone else in the world," she said. "She was my baby sister, and I was supposed to protect her, supposed to keep her safe. But when she got her Hogwarts letter, when she chose magic over me, I felt so abandoned. So I convinced myself that I hated everything about her new world, including magic itself. And when you came to live with us, you were a living reminder of everything I'd lost, everything I'd chosen to give up out of pride and stubbornness." Harry stared at her, processing words that reframed his entire understanding of his childhood. "You loved her." "I loved her," Petunia confirmed. "And I love you, Harry. I've always loved you, even when I was too broken and too proud to show it, even when Dumbledore's magic made it easier to push that love away." The tears Harry had been holding back finally spilled over. 16 years of believing himself fundamentally unwanted. 16 years of thinking he was a burden that no one could possibly choose to love. And now his aunt was telling him it had all been a lie. "I don't know how to believe that," he said honestly. "I don't know how to trust that you mean it, or that you won't change your mind when things get difficult." "Then don't," Petunia said, surprising him. "Don't trust me yet. Don't believe me yet. Let me prove it to you." Before Harry could respond, a soft knock on the classroom door interrupted them. Hermione and Ron peered inside, their expressions anxious. "Sorry to interrupt," Hermione said carefully, "but we wanted to make sure you were all right. That was a lot to process in there." Harry wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, grateful for their concern, even as part of him wanted to hide from their scrutiny. "Did you know," he asked, "about Dumbledore, about what he was doing to me?" Ron shifted uncomfortably. "We knew something wasn't right about how your relatives treated you. But we thought... we figured it was just because they were Muggles who hated magic." "We should have asked more questions," Hermione said, her voice thick with guilt. "We should have pushed harder when you came back to school looking like you hadn't eaten properly all summer. We should have..." "You should have been children," Petunia interrupted gently. "Which is what you were, and what Harry was. None of this was your responsibility to figure out or fix." She turned back to Harry. "But they're your friends, and their opinion matters to you. What do you think about what I've offered?" Harry looked between his aunt and his best friends, feeling the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. For the first time in his life, adults were asking what he wanted instead of telling him what was necessary. It was both liberating and terrifying. "I want to try," he said slowly. "I want to try living with you. Really living with you. Not just existing in your house until I'm old enough to leave. But I need to know that I can come back to Hogwarts if things don't work out. I need to know I have choices." "Of course you do," Petunia said immediately. "Harry, I'm not asking you to give up your independence, or your friends, or your school. I'm asking for the chance to give you a real home to come back to during holidays and summers, a place where you're wanted and welcomed, not just tolerated." "What about Uncle Vernon?" Harry asked. "He's not going to suddenly decide he loves having a wizard in the house." Petunia's expression hardened. "Vernon will adjust his attitude, or he will find himself living elsewhere. I've spent 15 years prioritizing his comfort over your well-being." "Harry, I won't make that mistake again." Hermione leaned forward. "What about the protection magic? If you're changing how Harry feels about living with you, won't that affect the blood wards?" "The blood wards are Dumbledore's problem," Petunia said firmly. "If his magic can't survive being built on love instead of suffering, then perhaps it was never as powerful as he claimed." Ron grinned suddenly. "Besides, Harry's got plenty of people willing to protect him now. The Order might have voted Dumbledore out of authority over Harry, but they didn't vote themselves out of caring about him." Harry felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with magic and everything to do with having people in his life who wanted to protect him without expecting him to die for their cause in return. "All right," he said, looking at his aunt with something that might have been hope. "Let's try this. But I want to spend the rest of the summer at the Burrow first, to give you time to handle Uncle Vernon, and to give myself time to believe this is real." Petunia nodded. "That's sensible. And Harry, thank you for giving me a chance to do better. I know I don't deserve it." "Everyone deserves a chance to do better," Harry said, echoing words Dumbledore had once spoken, though they tasted different in his mouth now. "The question is what you do with that chance." They were interrupted by another knock on the door, this one more tentative. Dumbledore appeared in the doorway, looking older and more frail than Harry had ever seen him. "I wish to speak with you, Harry," the headmaster said quietly, "about the practical implications of this new arrangement." Harry tensed, but Petunia placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Professor Dumbledore," she said coolly, "I believe the Order made it quite clear that you no longer have authority over Harry's welfare." "Indeed they did," Dumbledore acknowledged. "But the protection magic remains a concern. If Harry's emotional connection to Privet Drive changes significantly, the wards may weaken or fail entirely." "Then we'll deal with that if it happens," Harry said, surprised by his own certainty. "I'd rather be less magically protected and more genuinely loved than the other way around." Dumbledore studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps that is the wiser choice," he said. "Love has always been the most powerful magic, after all. I simply forgot that for a time." "You forgot it for 15 years, Petunia corrected sharply. "Don't minimize what you did with soft words about temporary forgetfulness." "You are quite right," Dumbledore said, and there was genuine contrition in his voice. "I offer no excuses, only acknowledgement of the harm I have caused. Harry, if you are willing, I would like to work with you to ensure your continued safety, without requiring your suffering as payment." Harry looked at the old wizard who had shaped so much of his life, feeling something complicated that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't hatred either. "We can try," he said finally. "But things are going to be different from now on. I'm going to have people who put my happiness above your greater good." Dumbledore's smile was sad but genuine. "I believe that will be the best thing for everyone, Harry, including the greater good itself." As the old wizard left them alone again, Harry turned to his aunt, his friends, and the possibility of a future that included both magic and love, protection and choice, belonging and freedom. "So," he said, and for the first time in memory, his smile felt entirely real. "When do we start?" Chapter 9. Magic and Muggle Roads. Arthur Weasley had worked magic on more than just Petunia's broken-down Ford Escort. Standing in the courtyard outside Hogwarts as he tinkered with the engine, his sleeves rolled up and grease staining his fingers, he'd managed to make the entire situation feel almost normal. As though Muggle aunts demanding answers from wizarding headmasters was just another Tuesday afternoon problem to be solved, with a few well-placed spells and some practical engineering. "There we go," he said cheerfully, wiping his hands on a rag that Petunia was fairly certain hadn't been there moments before. "Should run smooth as silk now. I've added a few subtle enhancements. Nothing dramatic, mind you. Just some efficiency charms and a GPS spell that'll help you avoid any lingering magical interference on the way home." Petunia stared at him. "You put magic in my car." "Just the helpful kind," Arthur assured her, with a grin that reminded her powerfully of his son. "Nothing that will explode or transform into anything else. I learned my lesson about that years ago." Despite everything, Petunia found herself almost smiling. "Thank you, Mr. Weasley. You've been very kind." "Arthur, please. And Mrs. Dursley, Petunia, what you did today took considerable courage. Lily would be proud of you." The words hit her unexpectedly hard, and she had to blink back tears as she climbed into the driver's seat. Harry slid into the passenger seat beside her, looking almost as overwhelmed as she felt. "Ready?" she asked, though she wasn't sure what she was asking him to be ready for. Harry nodded, fastening his seatbelt with the automatic gesture of someone who'd learned to value small safeties. "As ready as I can be." The first hour of the drive passed in uncomfortable silence, broken only by the radio playing soft classical music and the gentle hum of the engine, which now purred with an efficiency that was definitely magical. Petunia found herself stealing glances at Harry, trying to reconcile this quiet, thoughtful young man with the burden she'd trained herself to see him as. "You look like her," she said finally, surprising herself with the admission. "Not just your eyes. Everyone always mentions your eyes. But the way you think. I can see it when you're processing something difficult." Lily used to get that exact same expression when she was working through a problem. Harry turned to look at her, curious rather than defensive. What was she like? Before Hogwarts, I mean. When you were children. Petunia's hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories she'd long buried began to surface. She was brilliant. Not just magically brilliant, though the signs were there even before her letter came, but genuinely clever about everything. She could talk her way out of any trouble, charm any adult, make any game more interesting than it had been before she joined in. "Did you play together?" "All the time. We shared a room until she was 8, and she used to make up the most elaborate stories to tell me before we went to sleep. Adventures about sisters who could fly and talk to animals and save the world together." Petunia's voice caught slightly. "I loved those stories. Even after I knew they weren't just imagination, even after I knew she really could do impossible things, I still loved listening to her talk about magic." Harry was quiet for a moment, absorbing this glimpse of a relationship he'd never imagined. "What changed?" "Severus Snape," Petunia said without hesitation. "Not that it was entirely his fault. The magic was always going to come between us eventually. But when Lily started spending time with that strange boy from the council flats, when she started learning about her world before she'd even left for school, I felt replaced." She merged onto the motorway, grateful for the distraction of traffic as she continued. By the time her Hogwarts letter came, I'd already lost her. She was so excited about leaving, so eager to go somewhere I couldn't follow, and I was angry about being left behind. So I convinced myself I didn't want to go with her anyway. "But you wrote to Dumbledore," Harry said, and there was no judgment in his voice, "asking to attend Hogwarts." "One letter," Petunia confirmed. "One desperate, pathetic letter from an 11-year-old girl who couldn't bear the thought of losing her sister. And when he wrote back, explaining kindly but firmly that I didn't have magic and could never be part of that world, I decided I didn't want to be part of it anyway." They drove in comfortable silence for a while, the countryside rolling past outside the windows. Harry seemed to be processing her words, and Petunia found herself remembering more than she'd allowed herself to in years. "Tell me about your parents," she said eventually. "Not the way they died. I know that story. Tell me about how they lived." Harry's face brightened, and Petunia realized it was the first time she'd ever asked him about anything he might want to share. He was funny. Really funny, but not mean-spirited like Dudley's humor. He made people laugh with him, not at other people. And he was completely mad about Mum. You could tell just by looking at them together that she was his entire world. "And your mother?" "Fierce," Harry said immediately. "Everyone says she was kind, and she was, but she was fierce too. She never backed down when something mattered to her. Professor McGonagall told me once that Mum hexed a student who was bullying a first year, and when she got detention for it, She told the teacher it was worth it because the bullying stopped. Petunia smiled despite herself. That sounds exactly like something Lily would do. She once punched a boy at primary school for pulling my pigtails, got suspended for 3 days, and told Mum it was the best 3 days she'd ever spent because the boy never bothered either of us again. She protected you, Harry said softly. She always protected me, Petunia admitted, right up until I made it clear I didn't want her protection anymore. They stopped at a service station near Oxford to stretch their legs and grab something to eat. Petunia found herself doing something she'd never done before, actually teaching Harry practical things. She showed him how to check the oil level, how to calculate fuel efficiency, how to read a paper map in case the GPS failed. Small, mundane skills that Vernon had always dismissed as unnecessary for the boy to learn. "Why are you teaching me this?" Harry asked, as she explained the proper way to check tire pressure. Petunia paused, considering the question. "Because no one ever taught you how to live in the Muggle world, and that's not fair. You're not just a wizard, Harry. You're also my nephew, and you should know how to take care of yourself in both worlds." As they sat in the service station cafe sharing fish and chips, Harry told her about his friends, about Hogwarts traditions, about the small daily joys of his school life that had nothing to do with fighting dark wizards or fulfilling prophecies. In return, she told him about Lily's childhood obsession with horses, about the elaborate chalk drawings they'd made on the pavement outside their house, about the way Lily had cried for hours when their pet goldfish died when she was 9. "I kept some of her things," Petunia said, as they approached the final stretch of road toward Little Whinging. "Her books, some clothes, letters from school friends. I told myself I was keeping them for historical value, but really I couldn't bear to throw away the last pieces of her." Harry looked surprised. "Where are they?" "In what used to be her bedroom. I converted it to a sewing room years ago, but all her belongings are still there, in boxes in the wardrobe." She hesitated, then forged ahead. "I thought, if you wanted, you could have that room. It's bigger than Dudley's second bedroom, and it has better windows. It was always meant to be yours anyway. You're her son." "You'd give me Lily's room?" Harry's voice was thick with emotion. "I'd give you your mother's room," Petunia corrected gently. "The way it should have been from the beginning." As they turned onto Privet Drive, Petunia felt her stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. The street looked exactly as she'd left it that morning. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical houses, an atmosphere of determined normality that suddenly felt stifling after a day spent in a castle full of magic and possibility. Vernon's car was in the driveway, and she could see him through the front window, pacing back and forth in the sitting room like a caged animal. "He's angry," Harry observed, his voice carefully neutral. "He's frightened," Petunia corrected. "Vernon's always angry when he's frightened, and he's been frightened of you since the day you arrived." She parked the car and turned to face her nephew. "Harry, I need you to know that whatever happens in there, whatever Vernon says or does, my choice is made. You're my family, and you're welcome in this house for as long as you want to be here." Before Harry could respond, the front door flew open, and Vernon stormed down the front walk, his face purple with rage and his hands clenched into fists. "Where the bloody hell have you been?" he roared as Petunia climbed out of the car. "Gone all day without a word, and now you bring that freak back early? I told you, Petunia, I told you he wasn't to come back until—" "Vernon," Petunia said quietly, and something in her tone made him stop mid-sentence. "Harry is my nephew. This is his home, and you will treat him with respect, or you will find somewhere else to live." The entire street seemed to go silent. Mrs. Number 7 had frozen in the middle of watering her petunias. Mr. Number 12 had stopped washing his car and was watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. Vernon's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to splutter. "You can't be serious. Pet, this is my house, my family. This is our house," Petunia corrected, her voice growing stronger. "And Harry is our family, I've spent 15 years letting you dictate how we treated my sister's son, and it ends now. Today. This minute. But the neighbours, Vernon began desperately. The neighbours can think whatever they like, Petunia said, surprising herself with how little she cared about the watching eyes and listening ears. I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not for the sake of appearances. She turned to Harry, who was still sitting in the car, watching the confrontation with wide eyes. Come on then, let's go see your mum's room. As they walked toward the front door, leaving Vernon spluttering on the driveway, Petunia felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of making a choice based on love rather than fear. It was, she thought, exactly what Lily would have done. Chapter 10. Revolution in Little Whinging. The first morning after their return from Hogwarts, Petunia woke to the sound of Vernon banging pots and pans in the kitchen with unnecessary force. She found him standing over the stove, making what appeared to be breakfast for exactly 3 people: herself, himself, and Dudley. Harry's conspicuous absence from the meal preparation spoke volumes about Vernon's intentions. "Where's Harry's plate?" Petunia asked quietly, moving to the cupboard to retrieve a 4th setting. "Boy can make his own breakfast," Vernon muttered without turning around. "I'm not running a hotel for freaks." "Vernon," Petunia said, and this time there was steel in her voice. "Harry is a member of this family, and he will be treated as such. That includes eating meals with us, not being served scraps after we've finished." Vernon spun around, his face already flushing red. "Now you listen here, pet. Yesterday was some sort of temporary madness. But this is still my house, and I won't have that boy thinking he can— Good morning, Uncle Vernon. Aunt Petunia." Harry's voice from the doorway cut through Vernon's building tirade. He was dressed in clean clothes that actually fit him properly, clothes that Petunia had quietly purchased the evening before, while Vernon sulked in his study. "Is there anything I can help with?" The simple question hung in the air like a challenge. For 15 years, Harry had been expected to prepare meals for the family while being forbidden from eating with them. Now he was offering to help as an equal participant, rather than a servant. "Sit down, Harry," Petunia said firmly, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Vernon was just finishing breakfast for all of us." Vernon's mouth worked silently for several moments before he turned back to the stove, with enough force to rattle the plates on the counter. Dudley appeared in the doorway, looking confused and slightly apprehensive. At 17, he was old enough to understand that something fundamental had shifted in his family's dynamics, but young enough to be uncertain how he was supposed to react. "Morning, Dudley," Harry said, and there was no mockery or resentment in his voice, just tired acceptance. Morning, Harry," Dudley replied, then looked at his mother with obvious bewilderment. "Mum, why is Harry sitting at the table?" "Because he lives here," Petunia said simply. "Because he's family, and family eats together." The breakfast that followed was the most uncomfortable meal Petunia could remember, but also the most important. She made conversation with Harry about his plans for the day, asked about his friends, and discussed the weather as though having a normal family conversation was something they'd been doing for years rather than attempting for the first time. Vernon ate in stony silence, while Dudley alternated between staring at his cousin and looking to his parents for cues about how to behave. "Harry," Petunia said as they finished eating, "I thought we might go shopping this afternoon. You'll need proper clothes for when you visit the Weasleys, and I'd like to get you a mobile phone so we can stay in touch." Vernon choked on his coffee. "A mobile phone? For him?" "For my nephew," Petunia corrected. "So he knows he can reach me if he needs anything, wherever he is." The revolution continued throughout the day in small, deliberate acts of normalization. When Mrs. Number 7 rang the doorbell to nosily inquire about the disturbance the previous evening, Petunia invited her in for tea and introduced Harry as "my sister's son, visiting for the summer." "Oh," Mrs. Number 7 said, clearly deflated by the lack of scandal. "I thought, that is, we all thought you didn't get along with your sister's family." Families sometimes need time to heal old wounds, Petunia replied serenely, serving tea in her best china. Harry's a lovely young man. We're so pleased to have him with us. The woman left 20 minutes later, thoroughly confused but unable to find fault with Harry's polite conversation about his school experiences, carefully edited to remove any mention of magic, naturally. It was during the afternoon shopping trip that Mrs. Figg made her appearance. Petunia was helping Harry select clothes that fit properly when the elderly woman approached them in Marks and Spencer, her expression apologetic but determined. "Mrs. Dursley," she said quietly. "Might I have a word?" Petunia stiffened, recognizing something in the woman's tone that suggested this wasn't going to be a casual neighborly chat. "Of course, Mrs. Figg. Harry, why don't you try on those trousers?" As Harry disappeared into the changing room, Mrs. Figg leaned closer. "I know what happened at Hogwarts," she said quietly. "Dumbledore sent word yesterday evening. I wanted you to know that I agree with what you've done." "I see," Petunia said carefully. "And what exactly do you know about what happened at Hogwarts?" "I know that Dumbledore's been monitoring Harry through me for 15 years, Mrs. Figg admitted, her wrinkled face creased with guilt. "I know that I've been reporting on that poor boy's treatment, and I know that I should have spoken up years ago when I saw what was happening to him." Petunia studied the elderly woman's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "You're a squib." "Yes. And for 15 years, I've been Dumbledore's eyes and ears in little whinging. But Mrs. Dursley, Petunia, I want you to know that I never agreed with letting Harry suffer the way he has. I argued with Dumbledore more than once about it, but he always had reasons, always had explanations about the protection needing Harry to be miserable," Petunia finished flatly. "Yes," Mrs. Figg's voice was barely audible. "And I was too much of a coward to do more than file reports and hope someone else would intervene." Harry emerged from the changing room, looking between the two women with obvious curiosity. The trousers fit perfectly, and for the first time in his life, he looked like a normal teenager whose family cared about his appearance. "Those look wonderful, Harry," Petunia said warmly, then turned back to Mrs. Figg. "What will you tell Dumbledore now?" "The truth," Mrs. Figg replied, "that Harry Potter is finally being treated with the love and respect he should have received from the beginning, and if Dumbledore doesn't like it, he can find himself another spy." That evening, as Petunia was preparing dinner, with Harry helping rather than doing all the work himself, two familiar figures appeared at the front door. Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks stood on the doorstep, looking somewhat uncertain. "Mrs. Dursley," Lupin said politely, "we hope you don't mind the intrusion. We wanted to check on how the new arrangements are working out." "Of course," Petunia replied, stepping aside to let them in. "Harry, your friends from the Order are here." Vernon, who had been lurking in the sitting room, made a sound of protest. "Pet, you can't just invite freaks into our home whenever—" "Vernon," Petunia said, with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow child, "Professor Lupin and Miss Tonks are here to visit Harry. They are welcome in our home." "Actually," Tonks said, her hair shifting to a determined purple, "we're here to make sure Harry's being treated properly. No offense, Mrs. Dursley, but 15 years of habits don't usually change overnight." "None taken," Petunia replied calmly. "Harry, would you show them around? Let them see your room? Maybe explain how things have changed?" As Harry led the Order members upstairs, Vernon turned to his wife with desperation in his eyes. "Pet, this has gone too far. We can't have these people coming and going as they please. What will the neighbors think?" "The neighbors," Petunia said, continuing to chop vegetables with steady precision, "will think that we care about our nephew and want him to maintain his friendships, just like any normal family would." Vernon's attempts to sabotage the new dynamic continued for several days, but they grew increasingly pathetic. He forgot to include Harry when ordering takeaway. He made pointed comments about certain people using too much hot water. He left Harry's washing out of the machine when he moved clothes to the dryer. Each time, Petunia quietly but firmly corrected the behavior. She ordered extra food. She ensured Harry had access to hot water whenever he needed it. She moved his clothes herself and had a brief, private conversation with Vernon about the consequences of continued petty cruelty. "I mean it, Vernon," she said one evening as they stood in their bedroom, her voice low but implacable. "Continue this behavior, and you'll be finding somewhere else to live. I won't have Harry feeling unwelcome in his own home." "His own home," Vernon spluttered. "This is my house, pet. I've worked for 30 years to create a home that our nephew was afraid to exist in," Petunia interrupted. "Well, that ends now. Harry is welcome here, or you're not. Choose." The breakthrough came at dinner 3 nights later. Harry had received his OWL results that morning, an owl delivery that had sent Vernon into paroxysms of horror, and Petunia had read the letter with genuine pride. 7 OWLs, she announced to the family over roast chicken, including an outstanding in defense against the dark arts and exceeds expectations in charms and transfiguration. Dudley looked confused. "Is that good?" "It's excellent," Petunia said firmly, beaming at Harry. "Most students only take 5 or 6 OWLs, and Harry's scored well above average in nearly everything." Harry stared at her in amazement. You understand the grading system?" "I've been reading about magical education," Petunia admitted. "I thought I should understand what you're accomplishing at school. And what you've accomplished is impressive, Harry. You should be proud." For the first time in 15 years, Harry Potter sat at a family dinner table and felt genuinely proud of himself, with adults who cared enough to understand and celebrate his achievements. When Petunia suggested they go out for ice cream to celebrate, even Dudley seemed to catch some of the positive energy. "Can I tell people at school that my cousin got 7 OWLs?" he asked tentatively. "You can tell them that your cousin is brilliant," Petunia said warmly, just like his mother was. As they walked to the ice cream shop, the entire family, together, in public, Petunia caught sight of their reflection in a shop window. For the first time in years, they looked like a real family. Imperfect, still healing, but real. It was exactly what Lily would have wanted for her son. Chapter 11. The Price of Truth. The Daily Prophet arrived at breakfast 3 days later, with a headline that made Petunia nearly choke on her tea. "Muggle Guardian challenges magical authority. Dursley confrontation sparks order upheaval." The accompanying photograph showed a somewhat blurred image of Hogwarts with an inset picture of Petunia that had clearly been taken from a distance with a magical camera. "Bloody hell," Harry muttered, reading over her shoulder. "How did they—" "Language, Harry," Petunia said automatically, though her heart wasn't in the reprimand. She was too busy scanning the article, which painted her as everything from a courageous advocate for child welfare to a dangerous Muggle interfering in magical matters beyond her understanding. Vernon, who had been maintaining a sullen silence throughout breakfast for the past week, finally exploded. "This is what comes of your meddling, pet. Now we're in their newspapers for all the magical world to gawk at." The magical world needed to know what was being done in their name, Petunia replied calmly, though she felt anything but calm. If they're uncomfortable with the truth, perhaps they should examine why. Dudley, who had been gradually warming to the new family dynamic, looked between his parents with growing concern. "Are we in danger? Because you stood up to Harry's old headmaster." It was Harry who answered, his voice steady despite the obvious worry in his eyes. "No, Dudley. If anything, we're safer now. The people who might have wanted to hurt us were the ones who benefited from keeping the old arrangements secret." The Morning Post brought more evidence of the ripple effects. An official-looking letter from the Ministry of Magic arrived by a very nervous-looking owl, followed by a warm note from Professor McGonagall, and then, most surprisingly, a brief message from someone signing themselves simply as SS. "What does McGonagall say?" Harry asked as Petunia opened the neat, precise handwriting. "She's writing to tell us about changes at Hogwarts," Petunia said, scanning the letter quickly. "Dumbledore has stepped back from day-to-day administration. The Board of Governors is conducting a full review of his policies regarding student welfare, and she wants to invite us both to visit the school again before term starts, so we can discuss Harry's accommodation needs properly." Harry looked surprised. "She wants you involved in school decisions?" "Apparently," Petunia said, feeling a flutter of something that might have been pride. "She says that as your guardian, I should have input into your educational environment." The ministry letter proved to be from Arthur Weasley, writing in his official capacity, but with obvious personal warmth. He explained that the ministry was investigating potential violations of the International Statute of Secrecy, not by Petunia, but by those who had knowingly allowed a Muggle to be unknowingly influenced by magical compulsions for 15 years. "They want to interview you," Harry said, reading over her shoulder. "Both of us, actually, to document what happened and ensure it doesn't happen to other families." "Good," Petunia said firmly. "Other children shouldn't have to go through what you did." The third letter was the most cryptic. "Mrs. Dursley, I believe we should speak about our shared loss. I will call this afternoon if convenient. S. Snape," Harry said immediately. "That's Snape's handwriting. But why would he want to talk to you?" They discovered the answer when Professor Snape appeared at their front door at precisely 3 o'clock, looking as intimidating as ever, but somehow less hostile than Petunia remembered from their brief encounter at Hogwarts. Vernon, who had been lurking in the sitting room, took one look at the black-robed wizard and disappeared upstairs with remarkable speed. "Professor Snape," Petunia said, opening the door wider. "Please come in." He stepped into the hallway, his dark eyes taking in the changes that had been made since Harry's arrival. The family photographs that now included Harry, the coat hook that held his jacket alongside the others, the general atmosphere of a home where all residents were welcome. "You have made significant changes," he observed. "I've made necessary changes," Petunia corrected. "Would you like tea?" They sat in the kitchen, the same room where Harry had spent countless hours as an unwilling servant, now transformed into a space where he was invited to join family conversations. Snape accepted his tea with careful politeness, but Petunia could see him struggling with something. "You wanted to discuss Lily," she said gently. "I wanted to apologize," Snape said, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "For my part in what happened to her son." Petunia studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath his usual stern expression. "You were following orders." "I was following my own grief," Snape corrected. "My own guilt over Lily's death. When Dumbledore told me that Harry's suffering was necessary to protect him, I allowed myself to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that Lily had died for nothing." Harry, who had been quietly listening from his seat by the window, finally spoke. "She didn't die for nothing, Professor. She died to save me. That was enough." Snape turned to look at him, and Petunia saw something shift in his expression. "You have your mother's wisdom," he said quietly, "and her courage. I should have seen that years ago." "It's hard to see clearly through grief," Petunia said, thinking of her own 15 years of willful blindness. "But we can choose to see more clearly now." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Hermione Granger, who appeared at the kitchen door looking slightly out of breath and very excited. "Mrs. Dursley, I hope you don't mind my dropping by, but I had to see—" "Oh!" She stopped short at the sight of Professor Snape. "Professor, I didn't expect to see you here." "Miss Granger," Snape acknowledged with a nod. "I was just leaving." He turned back to Petunia. "Thank you for the tea, Mrs. Dursley, and for the conversation. I believe Lily would be proud of what you've accomplished here." After he left, Hermione settled into his vacated chair and looked around the kitchen with obvious amazement. "This is incredible," she said. "I mean, I knew things had changed, but seeing it in person, "Harry, you look so much happier." "I feel happier," Harry admitted. "It's strange, having a home where I'm actually wanted." "Mum's planning to invite Mrs. Dursley to the Burrow," Hermione said, turning to Petunia. "She wants to meet the woman who gave that useless old man what for, as she put it, though she might have used stronger language." Petunia found herself smiling. "I would like to meet her as well. Harry speaks very highly of Mrs. Weasley." "She's brilliant," Harry said warmly. "She's what I always imagined a real mum would be like." There was a moment of silence as Petunia absorbed the implications of that statement. Then she nodded. "Then I definitely need to meet her. Anyone who's been a mother to you when I couldn't be deserves my gratitude." The afternoon continued with more visitors and messages. Tonks stopped by to check on Harry's well-being and stayed for dinner, charming Dudley by changing her hair colour to match his. Lupin sent a note expressing his support and mentioning that several Order members were asking to meet the woman who had successfully challenged Dumbledore's authority. It was after dinner, as they sat in the living room watching television together, the first time in Harry's memory that such a thing had happened, that Vernon finally attempted what Petunia could only describe as reconciliation. "Pet," he said quietly during a commercial break, "I've been thinking about what you said, about choosing between Harry being welcome and me living here." Petunia muted the television. "And I realize I haven't been thinking clearly," Vernon admitted, not quite looking at Harry. "About a lot of things. About how we've treated the boy. About what's really important." "What brought this on, Dad?" Dudley asked, looking genuinely curious. Vernon was quiet for a long moment. "Watching your mother stand up to that headmaster. Seeing her choose to do what was right even when it was difficult. I want to be someone she can be proud of again." Harry looked uncomfortable with being discussed as though he weren't present, but Petunia was pleased to see that he didn't flinch or try to leave the room. "Progress," she thought. "If you want to try, Vernon," she said carefully, "then you need to start treating Harry like the nephew he is, not like an unwelcome burden." "I don't know how," Vernon admitted. "I don't understand his world, Pet. I don't understand magic or wizards or any of it, and it frightens me. It was Dudley who spoke up, surprising everyone. I don't understand it either, Dad. But Harry's not scary. He's just Harry." Harry turned to look at his cousin with obvious surprise. "Dudley." "I've been thinking too," Dudley said, his face reddening slightly. "About all the times all the things I said and did, about how we treated you. And I wanted to say I'm sorry, and to ask, could you maybe explain some of it? The magic stuff? I mean, if you want to." The conversation that followed was halting and occasionally awkward, but it was the first genuine exchange between Harry and his cousin in 16 years. Harry explained about Hogwarts, about his friends, about the difference between harmful magic and everyday spells. Dudley asked questions about Quidditch and magical creatures, and what it was like to live in a castle. Vernon remained mostly silent, but Petunia caught him listening intently when Harry described the protective charms around Hogwarts, the way the magical community worked together to keep students safe. "So the school is actually safer than here?" Vernon asked eventually. "Much safer," Harry confirmed, "at least from external threats." "Then you should go," Vernon said quietly. "When term starts, you should go and not worry about how things are here. We'll sort ourselves out." "He'll go," Petunia said firmly, "but he'll come back for holidays knowing he has a real home waiting for him. Won't you, Harry?" Harry smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way Petunia was still learning to recognize. "Yes," he said. "I will." As the evening wound down and they prepared for bed, Petunia felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for years. The magical world might be debating her actions in their newspapers. The Ministry might want to interview her about magical law violations, and Dumbledore's reputation might be in ruins. But in her own small corner of little whinging, something broken was finally being repaired. and tomorrow Harry would leave for the Burrow to spend time with the family that had loved him when she couldn't. But for the first time in 15 years, he would leave, knowing he had a family that loved him, waiting for his return. Chapter 12. Letters Home. Standing on platform 9 3/4 for the first time in her life, Petunia Dursley felt as though she'd stepped into one of the stories Lily used to tell her before bedtime. The magical barrier between platforms had been surprisingly gentle, parting like warm water around her as Harry guided her through, and now she found herself surrounded by a world that was both alien and strangely familiar. "It's exactly as she described it," she whispered, watching the Hogwarts Express release great puffs of steam while students in robes hugged their families goodbye. The red engine, the owls, the chaos of it all. Harry stood beside her with his trunk at his feet, looking more confident and settled than she'd ever seen him. 3 weeks at the Burrow had been good for him. He'd returned taller, broader, with Ron and Hermione's easy friendship having smoothed away some of the sharp edges that years of isolation had left on him. But it was the way he smiled when he looked at her that made Petunia's heart swell with quiet pride. "Are you sure you're all right?" Harry asked for the 3rd time. "I know this must be overwhelming." "I'm exactly where I need to be," Petunia replied firmly. "Seeing you off to school properly, like family should." Hermione appeared beside them, her parents in tow, looking excited to meet the woman who had become something of a legend in their social circle. "Mrs. Dursley, Mum and Dad have been dying to meet you ever since I told them what you did." The Grangers were everything Petunia had expected. Intelligent, caring, slightly bewildered by the magical world, but fiercely protective of their daughter's place in it. As they chatted about the challenges of raising magical children in a Muggle household, Petunia felt a kinship she hadn't expected. "We've always felt a bit out of our depth," Mrs. Granger admitted, "like we're missing something essential about Hermione's life." "I felt that way for 15 years, Petunia said quietly. "But I've learned that love matters more than understanding every detail. The understanding can come later." Ron appeared with his family in tow, the famous Weasley clan that had embraced Harry as one of their own. Molly Weasley swept Petunia into a hug before she could protest, tears streaming down her round face. "Oh, my dear," Molly said warmly, "thank you. Thank you for giving our Harry a real family at last." "Thank you for loving him when I couldn't," Petunia replied, her own voice thick with emotion. "For being the mother he needed." Arthur Weasley shook her hand with genuine respect. "What you did took remarkable courage, Petunia. The magical world owes you a debt it can never fully repay." As the time for departure approached, Petunia found herself reluctant to let Harry go, even knowing he would return for Christmas with genuine excitement rather than resigned obligation. "Write to me," she said, helping him load his trunk onto the train. "Not because you have to, but because you want to. Tell me about your classes, your friends, the small moments that make you happy." "I will," Harry promised. And then, for the first time in 16 years, he hugged her goodbye with genuine affection. "Thank you, Aunt Petunia, for everything, for choosing me." "I should have chosen you 15 years ago," she said into his hair. "But I'm choosing you now, and I'll keep choosing you for the rest of my life." As the Hogwarts Express pulled away from the platform, Petunia stood waving until the red engine disappeared around a bend, her heart full of something she was finally ready to call maternal love. The journey home to Little Whinging passed in comfortable contemplation. Vernon had surprised her by asking to come to the platform, then surprising her further by actually being polite to Harry's friends. Dudley had shyly shaken Harry's hand and mumbled something about looking forward to hearing about the magic stuff at Christmas. Small steps, but genuine ones. Harry's first letter arrived 2 days later, delivered by a beautiful tawny owl that had clearly been instructed to be patient with nervous muggles. Petunia fed it some bacon and water before untying the letter with hands that shook only slightly. "Dear Aunt Petunia, I wanted to write immediately to tell you about my first days back at Hogwarts. Everything feels different now, not the castle or my friends, but the way I feel about being here. For the first time, I'm at school knowing I have a real home to return to, and it's changed everything. Professor McGonagall asked me to her office yesterday. She wanted to discuss my new family circumstances and ensure I was settling in well. I told her about our shopping trips, about family dinners, about the way you celebrated my OWL results. She actually cried, Aunt Petunia. She said it was what Mum would have wanted for me. The other students have noticed the change too. I don't flinch when people touch me unexpectedly anymore. I don't hoard food or worry about having nowhere to go for holidays. Hermione says I seem settled in a way I never was before. Even my relationship with Dumbledore is different. He treats me with respect now, asks for my opinion, instead of just telling me what's necessary. I think your confrontation changed more than just our family. It changed how everyone thinks about children's rights in the magical world. I miss you already, which is something I never thought I'd be able to say about Privet Drive. But now it's not just Privet Drive, is it? It's home. Give my love to Uncle Vernon and Dudley. Tell them I'm looking forward to showing Dudley some simple magic tricks at Christmas if he's still interested. All my love, Harry P.S. I found something in Mum's trunk that McGonagall returned to me. A letter she never sent, addressed to you. I'm not sure if you want to read it, but I'll bring it home at Christmas if you do. Petunia read the letter 3 times before carefully folding it and placing it in her jewellery box, the same box where she'd kept Lily's correspondence for so many years. Then she sat down at her kitchen table with a pad of writing paper and composed her first letter to Harry Potter, nephew and family member, rather than to the boy, who had been an unwelcome obligation. Her response was warm, newsy, and full of the kind of maternal pride she'd never allowed herself to express. She told him about Vernon's tentative efforts to understand the magical world, including his awkward questions about wizard employment opportunities. She described Dudley's request for books about magic for normal people to understand. She shared neighbourhood gossip and asked about his friends and his classes with genuine interest. But it was after she'd sent Harry's letter that Petunia found herself drawn to the task she'd been avoiding for weeks. Lily's final letter, the one she'd never properly answered, lay in her jewellery box like an unhealed wound. She retrieved it on a quiet Sunday evening while Vernon watched television and Dudley did homework upstairs. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but Lily's words were as clear as if they'd been written yesterday. October 28th, 1981. Tuny, this will probably be my last letter to you. The Dark Lord has found us, and I don't think we have much time left. I'm not writing to say goodbye. I'm writing to say thank you. Thank you for being my sister, even when I made it difficult. Thank you for protecting me when we were children, even before you knew I needed protection from more than playground bullies. Thank you for teaching me what family loyalty meant, even when I was too young and selfish to appreciate it. I know you think magic took me away from you, but you're wrong. Magic showed me how precious our bond really was. Every spell I learned, every wonder I discovered, I wanted to share with you. Every friend I made, I compared to the sister who had been my first and best friend. The magical world gave me many gifts, but none as valuable as the memory of growing up with you. I know you're angry with me. I know you think I chose magic over our family. But Tuny, I never chose magic over you. I chose magic and you. I always believed that someday you would see that love was bigger than the differences between us. If something happens to me, if James and I don't survive what's coming, please don't let my son grow up thinking his mother didn't have a family who loved her. Tell him about the sister who shared her room and her secrets, who made up stories and kept me safe from bad dreams. Tell him that his mum had a sister who taught her what love looked like, long before magic ever touched our lives. And Tuny, if you can find it in your heart, love Harry for me. Not because Dumbledore asks you to, not because magic compels you to, but because he's the best parts of both of us. He's going to need someone who remembers that love existed in our family, long before prophecies and wars made everything complicated. I forgive you for not answering my letters. I forgive you for being angry about the choice I made. I hope someday you'll forgive me for making it. I love you, Tuny. I always have. I always will. Your sister, Lily Petunia, read the letter through tears that had been 15 years in the making. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write a response that was 16 years overdue. Dear Lily, I should have written this letter years ago. I should have written it the day Harry came to live with us, or the day he turned 11 and got his Hogwarts letter, or any of the 1,000 days in between when I felt the ghost of your love in our house, and was too proud and too frightened to acknowledge it. I forgive you for choosing magic. More than that, I understand why you chose it. You were always meant for extraordinary things, Lily. Even as children, I knew you were destined for a bigger world than little whinging could contain. I was angry not because you left, but because I couldn't follow. You asked me to love Harry for you, and I'm ashamed to say it took me 15 years to learn how. But I'm learning now, Lily. I'm loving him the way you would have wanted, not as a burden or an obligation, but as the remarkable young man you and James created together. He has your courage and your compassion. He has your way of making people feel seen and valued. He has your fierce loyalty and your stubborn insistence on doing what's right even when it's difficult. And yes, he has your habit of attracting trouble, though I'm learning to see that as a feature rather than a flaw. I kept all your letters, Lily. Every single one. I told myself it was sentiment, but really it was hope. Hope that someday I would be worthy of the sister who never stopped believing love was stronger than fear. I'm trying to be worthy now. I'm trying to be the aunt you believed I could be, the sister you deserved to have. I'm trying to give Harry the family you wanted him to have, messy and imperfect, but real and lasting. Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I'd given up on myself. Thank you for trusting me with the most precious thing in your world. I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving worthy of that trust. I love you, Lily. I always have. I always will. Your sister, Petunia. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope addressed to Lily Evans Potter, Godric's Hollow Cemetery. Tomorrow she would drive there and leave it on her sister's grave, a conversation completed, a wound finally healed. But tonight she had another task to finish. She retrieved a small silver frame from the back of her bedroom closet, one that had been hidden away for 15 years. The photograph inside showed two little girls with their arms around each other, grinning at the camera with gap-toothed smiles. Lily couldn't have been more than 7, Petunia perhaps 9, and they looked like what they were, sisters who loved each other without reservation. She dusted off the frame and carried it downstairs, placing it on the mantelpiece where everyone could see it. Vernon looked up from his newspaper and studied the photograph with something that might have been understanding. She was beautiful, he said quietly. Like Harry. They both have that same light about them. Yes, Petunia agreed, settling beside him on the sofa. They do. Upstairs, Dudley was practicing writing with his left hand, a skill he claimed might be useful if he ever met someone who wrote with magical quills. The house felt settled, peaceful, like a place where love lived and thrived. And in her jewelry box, Lily's letters lay beside Harry's newest correspondence, past and present finally reconciled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose love over fear. But tonight, for the first time in 16 years, Petunia Dursley fell asleep knowing she was exactly who she was meant to be. A sister who had learned to forgive, an aunt who had learned to love, and a guardian who had finally learned that family was not something you were born into, but something you chose to build, one brave decision at a time.